They never told you that Victorian childhood often ended before it even began. Most people imagine lace manners and innocence, but the truth stayed buried under coal dust, cold floors and small bodies forced to work until their hands split. You'll see how cities grew brighter, while children's lives grew darker, how progress demanded a price paid in silence, and how an entire generation was raised like tools, not humans. Tonight you will walk with me into the childhood they were never allowed to have. So before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If anyone had watched the smallest figures moving through Victorian streets with a quiet, patient eye, they would have seen that these children were carrying a weight far heavier than the baskets or tools in their hands. Their steps were steady but subdued, their faces marked by a kind of early resignation that did not belong to childhood. They did not wander, they did not drift, and they did not play. They walked with the fixed purpose of people who already understood that life required work from them long before they were ready to give it. No one around them questioned this. A child who worked was described as useful, while a child who played was considered wasteful, undisciplined, or a burden. In the tight, dim alleys, where factory smoke hung low and houses leaned into one another, mornings began the same way for nearly every poor family. Children woke not to the sound of someone calling them gently, but to the shifting of adults preparing for another long day of labor. A child's job was simple: rise, dress, and leave the house before the sun had fully settled into the sky. Their small hands fumbled with boots, coats, and tools that were never the right size. Their bodies shivered in the damp cold, yet they moved quickly, because being slow meant being punished or replaced. Inside these homes, there was no concept of protecting a child from hardship. Work was treated as the natural beginning of life. A toddler who could barely speak might be sent to hold a basket for a mother selling vegetables. A slightly older child was expected to run errands across town, dodging carts, horses, and factory wagons, as if they had been born, already trained for danger. By the time a child could speak in full sentences, people assumed they could earn their own keep. The poorest families saw no other option. A household survived only if every member contributed. That belief shaped the children from their earliest years. They grew up understanding hunger, debt, and exhaustion before understanding anything else. When they looked toward the wealthy districts, where other children played in gardens, laughed with nurses, and held polished toys, it was like watching a distant world that had nothing to do with them. That separation, though silent, carved itself into their lives. Childhood was not something they lost. It was something they were never allowed to touch. As the city stirred each morning, these young laborers blended into the movement of adults. Their heads dropped slightly from the weight of sacks, crates, or metal tools. Their clothes were thin and worn, patched again and again until the fabric could no longer hold another stitch. Some carried the dark dust of the factories on their skin, while others smelled of fish, coal, or sewage from the jobs they had been assigned. They rarely spoke. Silence was a habit born from necessity, not temperament. Talking slowed them down. Laughing attracted scolding. Complaining changed nothing. Many of these children never learned to associate mornings with possibility. Their days followed a fixed structure work until hunger forced a pause. Eat whatever scraps they could afford, then continue working until darkness closed the streets. They did not ask for toys or books because they had never been taught to imagine such things. Stories were not read to them. Birthdays were not celebrated. Their milestones were measured not by age but by endurance. The first time they carried a heavier load, the first time they worked a full shift, the first time they were trusted to replace an adult. Workers who passed by them each day rarely questioned the sight. It was simply how things were. Even officials and reformers, when they took notice, framed the issue as a matter of morality rather than cruelty. Children were expected to be disciplined, obedient, and productive. A child who worked long hours without complaint was praised for being strong. A child who hesitated or tired too quickly was shamed for being weak. These judgments made the system feel justified, even noble, though it rested entirely on the exploitation of the smallest and most defenseless. There were moments when these children paused, standing still in the middle of a street or factory floor, as if their bodies were briefly reminded of what it meant to be young. But those moments passed quickly. Hunger pushed them forward. Fear pushed them forward. and the knowledge that their families relied on every coin they earned pushed them forward most of all. Childhood was not a phase. It was a luxury belonging to someone else. Even the few amusements they encountered were shaped by work. A stick might become a tool. A piece of rope might become something to carry goods with. A stray marble found on the ground might be pocketed not as a toy, but as a small object that could be traded. Nothing in their lives encouraged imagination for its own sake. And yet, if one stood among them long enough, it became clear that these children carried more than the burden of labor. They carried the quiet consequences of a society that celebrated progress, while denying its youngest members the most basic form of humanity. They were not seen as beings who needed care. They were seen as resources, small bodies filling the gaps left by machines not yet invented, and wages adults could not afford to reject. The harsh truth was simple: childhood in Victorian poverty was not stolen. It was never given. Everything here reveals how life began with labor rather than innocence. What waits beyond this first layer of hardship reaches even deeper into the places they tried to call home. There are rooms where the air itself feels like a cage, holding children in ways no lock or chain could match. The narrow rooms where poor Victorian families lived were never meant to hold so many bodies, yet they did day after day without relief. Children grew up inside these cramped spaces, as if they were tiny compartments built to confine their movements and expectations. The walls sweated moisture from leaking pipes, floors stayed damp even in summer, and the faint smell of mold settled into every piece of clothing. Nothing inside these homes suggested safety or childhood. Every corner pressed inward, reminding the youngest members of the household that space was a privilege they would never know. The slums were not temporary shelters, they were long-term cages, disguised as homes. Each room often held more than one family, with beds shared between adults and children, or sometimes not shared at all, because there were no beds to use. Many children slept on piles of rags, wooden boards, or directly on cold brick floors. At night, the sounds of coughing rats scratching in the walls and distant factory whistles created a restless kind of silence, one that made it impossible to forget how little comfort existed here. Hygiene was almost impossible. Families shared broken water pumps or contaminated wells, and the same bucket used to wash hands might later be used to rinse vegetables or wipe the floor. Children who crawled or walked barefoot experienced the filth of the environment before they could understand it. Their hands touched grime, then touched their faces, their food, their thin blankets. Illness was constant, not as an exception, but as a condition of existence. The unhealthy environment shaped them long before work did. What trapped them most was not the physical size of the room, but the lack of any path beyond it. Children could see the world outside through small, fogged windows, yet most of what they saw was the same as what was inside: soot, smoke, exhaustion, and crowds of people moving too quickly to notice them. For many, stepping outside did not mean freedom. It simply meant entering another version of the same confinement: alleys too narrow, buildings too tall, streets too chaotic. Every direction led back into hardship. The adults in these homes rarely had time to speak to their children, except to issue instructions. Carry this clean, but go watch the baby hurry before someone else takes the job. These commands replaced affection. Parents were not cruel by nature. They were shaped by poverty until urgency became their only language. They believed that constant caution and constant work were the only gifts they could offer. Anything less would leave the child unprepared for a world that punished weakness without hesitation. Children learned early to move quietly, keep out of the way, and take up as little space as possible. When the father returned from exhausting labor, or the mother sold goods from morning until night, no one wished for noise or laughter. A child who played too loudly might be scolded, not because joy was forbidden, but because joy felt out of place. It did not fit the rhythm of survival. That rhythm demanded silence, discipline, and endurance. The emotional confinement was just as powerful as the physical one. Children were taught not to dream beyond their surroundings. Schools, toys, and idle hours were not part of their imagination because they had never seen them. They grew up believing that life was supposed to feel like this: constant pressure, constant fatigue, constant uncertainty. Even when they saw wealthier districts from a distance, they did not envy. They simply assumed that those streets belonged to a different kind of human. Every attempt to improve living conditions fell apart quickly. A family might clean their small space as best they could, but the walls still leaked, the ceiling still dripped, and the neighbors still overcrowded the hallway. Any order created inside the home could collapse in a single night when rain seeped through the rooftop or a rat chewed through the stored food. These children absorbed the lesson that stability was temporary and comfort was not their right. Some neighborhoods were so dense that children could not step outside without squeezing past adults' carts or heaps of refuse. The air tasted of coal dust and stale water. Markets overflowed with rotting vegetables, fish scraps, and vendor stalls set up wherever space allowed. Children walking through these areas often carried loads heavier than their bodies could handle, reinforcing the idea that they were simply moving pieces in a larger suffocating system rather than individuals with needs or hopes. Even in moments when a child found a quiet corner or a tiny stretch of street to pause, there was no feeling of escape. The world followed them. The smell of damp rooms clung to their clothes. The memory of chores filled their thoughts, and the sound of someone calling their name always arrived too quickly. Their minds were crowded the same way their homes were full of obligations and expectations, leaving no space for childhood. The term cage might seem dramatic when describing a home, yet it was the closest truth. These places did not protect children. They confined them. They shaped their posture, their breath, their sense of worth. Children learned to shrink into themselves to survive. They learned not to ask for more. The city did not need chains to restrain them. Poverty did that work with absolute efficiency. And as each day repeated the one before it, these children learned a silent truth. Freedom was something they would not encounter unless they grew strong enough or lucky enough to step outside the boundaries drawn for them by birth. Every detail here shows how their lives were surrounded by walls built from poverty rather than bricks. What lies ahead reveals a landscape where confinement extended beyond the home and into the work they were forced to accept. Tasks were waiting for them that no adult would willingly take, yet children carried them as if they had no choice at all. Children in Victorian cities stepped into the world of labor long before their bodies were prepared for it. They entered mines, factories, chimneys, and slaughter yards as if these places were natural extensions of childhood. Nothing about the work suited their size or fragility, yet their small bodies were precisely the reason they were chosen. Adults could not fit into narrow shafts or crawl spaces. Machines required hands that could slip between gears. Employers understood this well, and they used children as tools rather than as human beings. In coal mines, the air was thick and heavy, carrying dust that clung to the lungs with every breath. Children descended into these dark passages carrying lamps or hauling baskets of coal larger than their torsos. Some worked as trappers, sitting alone in pitch-black tunnels to open and close ventilation doors for hours without moving. The silence was absolute except for distant rumbling, a reminder that a mine collapse was always possible. Many children spent their entire shifts without seeing another human face. They emerged at the end of the day covered in black dust, coughing until their chests ached, and then returned the next morning. Above ground, the factories were no kinder. Machines consumed space and sound, filling every room with an unbroken roar. Children ran between belts, spindles, and gears, clearing jams or retrieving dropped materials. A moment of hesitation could lead to mangled fingers or severed limbs. Supervisors rarely slowed the machines for a child's safety. Production mattered more than caution. Injuries were invisible, in the daily chaos absorbed into the noise of grinding metal and the indifference of those in charge. Some children worked cleaning chimneys, a job that looked simple from the outside, but demanded an acrobat's agility and a miner's endurance. They crawled through narrow flues, coated in soot, their knees and elbows scraping against brick. Many became stuck when their bodies grew, slightly leading to suffocation or falls. The soot entered their mouths, eyes, and lungs, scarring them from within. Adults knew the dangers, but continued to send children into the chimneys because they were small enough to reach places no adult could. The work involving animals brought a different kind of horror. In slaughterhouses or street cleaning crews, children were tasked with removing carcasses, scraping blood from cobblestones, or disposing of dead livestock left to rot in alleyways. The sights and smells were overwhelming. Rotting flesh attracted flies, rats, and disease. But the children were expected to continue without hesitation. Most learned to suppress their reactions quickly. Any reluctance was treated as disobedience. Regardless of the job, one constant defined their lives the length of each day. Children often worked 12 to 16 hours, with no days off and no consideration for their age. Exhaustion was woven into every movement, and sleep became a brief interruption rather than a period of rest. When dawn returned, so did the work. Their bodies stopped distinguishing between weekdays and Sundays because every day felt the same, monotonous, demanding, and unforgiving. The danger was not only physical. Long hours in darkness or noise chipped away at their minds. Children who spent their days in mines learned to fear silence because it reminded them of the weight of the earth above. Those in factories became accustomed to the constant threat of machines catching their clothing or hair. They reacted to sudden noises with instinctive dread, conditioned by accidents they had seen or narrowly avoided. In slaughter yards, the smell of blood stayed with them, saturating their clothes and thoughts. Accidents were common enough that they barely shocked anyone. A crushed hand, a burned arm, a broken leg, these outcomes were accepted as ordinary hazards. A child who survived an accident might still be dismissed for being less useful. Many lost their jobs after injuries, forcing them back into the streets to beg or search for work elsewhere. The cycle of danger was relentless and left little room for healing. What made the situation worse was the lack of alternatives. Families relied on the income these children brought home. Without their earnings, rent went unpaid, food became scarce, and younger siblings fell further into deprivation. Children understood this from an early age. Their sense of duty replaced any sense of personal safety. They pushed themselves harder because survival depended on it. The pressure of knowing that their labor kept the household alive was a burden far too heavy for their age. In rare moments when a child paused during work, a flicker of innocence might appear. A glance at birds outside a factory window, a moment of curiosity in a mine tunnel, a quiet breath before re-entering a chimney. But these moments dissolved quickly. Supervisors barked orders, machinery clattered, or coal dust pressed into their faces. The world reminded them that they were not meant for wonder. They were meant for labor. The adults overseeing them were not always malicious. Many were indifferent, worn down by their own hardships. But indifference can be just as damaging as cruelty. When no one sees a child as a child, danger becomes invisible. Pain becomes routine. Lives become expendable. The children themselves began to internalize this view, believing that their worth depended solely on how much work they could complete. And through all this, the city continued to celebrate progress and industry, even as it built that progress on the smallest, most vulnerable shoulders. The machines grew faster, factories expanded, and mines dug deeper. Yet the children remained beneath it all unnoticed, carrying the weight of a society that preferred not to acknowledge how much it relied on them. Everything described here shows how labor consumed their bodies long before age had the chance to shape them. What extends from this struggle leads into the places where danger was not only expected but guaranteed. Shadows were waiting in narrow spaces that turned ordinary days into silent tests of endurance. The chimneys, scattered across Victorian towns and cities, looked ordinary from the outside. Tall brick columns rising above rooftops carrying smoke into the grey air. But inside those narrow shafts, darkness held a different meaning, and children were the ones forced to confront it. Boys barely old enough to walk were pushed into these cramped spaces, their small frames treated as the perfect tools for a job no adult would risk. Their size made them valuable, and that value erased any thought of safety. A child's work began before sunrise. Masters shook them awake, handed them brushes, scrapers, or sacks, and pointed toward rooftops slick with morning frost. The boys climbed with a familiarity that should not have belonged to their age, hands gripping loose bricks, feet searching for footholds along uneven tiles. Some were only 5 years old, yet they moved across chimneys as if they had spent decades learning the paths. Fear did not disappear, but necessity pressed it deep enough that it no longer slowed them down. At the entrance to a chimney, the boys squeezed themselves into openings so narrow that even turning their heads became impossible. The bricks pressed into their shoulders and spines, scraping skin raw. They pushed upward or downward depending on the assignment, scraping soot, with brushes tied to short rods, or with their own hands. Many had to climb without tools at all, relying on elbows and knees to clear passageways. With each movement, clouds of soot filled the air, coating their throats and lungs until breathing felt like swallowing ash. Inside the shaft, silence was broken only by scratches against brick and the faint coughs they tried to stifle. Dust settled into their eyes, burning until tears mixed with soot and streaked down their cheeks. The boys could not wipe their faces. They had no space to move their arms. Every inch of progress required effort that left their muscles trembling. Falling meant injury or death. Stopping meant punishment. The climb continued because it had to. Burns were common. Some chimneys had been used recently, and the bricks remained hot enough to blister skin on contact. Children who unknowingly entered these shafts pressed their bodies against heat that scorched through clothing. They emerged with red peeling patches that never fully healed, yet they were sent back up the next day without question. Broken bones were just as frequent. A misplaced step on the rooftop or a slip on damp tiles could send a child tumbling to the street below. Those who survived often carried the damage for life. The disease grew inside their lungs. The constant inhalation of soot created a slow erosion of health, persistent coughing, wheezing, and infections that weakened them long before adulthood. Some developed chimney sweeps cancer, a rare form of scrotal cancer caused by prolonged exposure to soot. It was one of the earliest occupational cancers ever documented. Yet children continued to be sent into chimneys, even after the risks were known. Their bodies became evidence of a danger society refused to acknowledge. Punishment awaited those who hesitated. Masters were often harsh, believing fear kept children obedient. Some forced boys to climb faster by lighting straw beneath them, letting the rising heat and smoke drive them upward. Others threatened beatings or withheld food. The lessons were brutal. Keep moving, ignore pain, do not cry, and never refuse the climb. The youngest absorbed these rules before they fully understood language. When the boys emerged from the chimneys, their faces appeared entirely black except for the whites of their eyes. Their clothes were saturated with soot. Some shook uncontrollably, their limbs stiff from hours in cramped positions. Others crawled out, gasping, desperate for air that did not carry smoke. Yet rest was brief. If another chimney needed cleaning, they were pushed onward without pause. On the streets, people often recognized them instantly. Their appearance was unmistakable. Small figures covered in black dust, moving with a cautious stiffness. But recognition did not lead to sympathy. Many saw them as part of the landscape, no different from the factory noise or the smell of coal. They were children performing a necessary function, and the danger they faced was dismissed as a routine inconvenience. The contradiction was stark. A society that prided itself on discipline, morality, and progress relied on the unseen labor of boys crawling through chimneys meant for smoke, not human bodies. The city celebrated its warm hearths and glowing fireplaces, while ignoring the suffering required to keep them clean. Families sat beside their fires at night, unaware or unwilling to consider that a child had scraped soot from those same flues only hours earlier. Even when reforms were proposed, resistance remained strong. Employers argued that children were essential for the trade. Some insisted the work built character or discipline. Those arguments survived because they were convenient, not because they held. Progress in this trade did not come from concern for children, but from shifts in technology that slowly made manual cleaning less necessary. Until then, boys continued to fill the spaces machines could not reach. A few rare individuals attempted to intervene. Doctors who documented injuries, activists who wrote about cruelty, neighbors who spoke of suffering but their voices struggled to be heard. The economic forces behind the trade were too powerful, and as long as society viewed poor children as expendable, the practice remained embedded in daily life. In the end, chimney sweeping became one of the clearest symbols of Victorian exploitation, not because it was the worst job, but because it revealed how easily a child's body could be shaped, used, and discarded when poverty demanded obedience, and industry demanded efficiency. Everything seen here reveals how small bodies were forced into spaces never meant for human life. What unfolds beyond this labor exposes dangers that followed children even after they left the chimneys behind. There were places where filth and disease surrounded them so completely that survival felt like a fragile accident. The neighborhoods where poor Victorian children lived were defined not only by cramped rooms and fading brick walls, but by an absence of sanitation so complete that it shaped every breath they took. Waste flowed through alleys in thin, irregular streams, carrying with it the smell of decay that clung to clothing and hair, no matter how often a child tried to wipe it away. The ground was never dry. Mud mixed with refuse, forming a layer that stuck to bare feet and seeped into cracks in the floorboards of their homes. Most families did not have private toilets. They shared crude outdoor pits with dozens of other households, and even those were luxuries compared to families who had nothing at all. In many places, children relieved themselves in corners of alleys, beside piles of rubbish, or near the same water pumps where families collected drinking water. It was common to see toddlers squatting beside broken walls, or older children holding onto railings as they tried to avoid splashing into puddles that carried filth from dozens of homes. No one questioned it. Sanitation required resources that the poor would never have. Inside the homes, cleanliness was nearly impossible. Floors were rarely washed because water had to be carried long distances, often from pumps contaminated by sewage or runoff from factories. Buckets of water served multiple purposes: cleaning pots, rinsing hands, wiping walls, or attempting to wash a child. By the end of the day, the water itself was darker than the dirt it was meant to remove. Children who touched the floors, walls, or bedding carried these contaminants into their mouths without realizing it. Rubbish collection was inconsistent or non-existent. Streets are filled with discarded vegetables, animal remains, broken pots, and human waste. Rats thrived in this environment. They scurried across rooftops, darted between doorways, and gnawed through anything resembling food. Children encountered them daily. Sometimes the rats stole from their hands. Sometimes they attacked when hunger made them bold. Infections from bites were common, and many children carried scars that would never fade. The smell of these neighborhoods formed an invisible boundary. Visitors could smell them long before entering. For the children who lived there, the odor became part of their identity. It soaked into their clothes until even fresh air could not remove it. Some children believed the scent followed them everywhere, marking them as residents of the slums, even in places where they tried to hide their origins. Disease thrived in the stagnant water pooled around homes. Cholera swept through the streets with a speed that terrified even adults who had grown accustomed to death. Typhoid and dysentery spread through contaminated wells, passing quickly between children who shared cups, food scraps, or sleeping spaces. Worm infestations were common enough that protruding bellies became a recognizable sign of poverty. Pale skin, brittle hair, and chronic coughing defined childhood not as a phase, but as a diagnosis. Illness was not an event, but a constant presence. Children moved through their days with fevers, stomach cramps, or persistent diarrhea. They played in the same alleys where sewage flowed. They washed their faces with water that carried invisible threats. Their toys, if they had any, were often found in rubbish heaps and coated with filth. Each touch carried risk, and every meal prepared in cramped kitchens held the possibility of contamination. Mothers tried to maintain some level of order, wiping surfaces with cloths soaked in cold water, or hanging bedding in narrow patches of sunlight to dry. But their efforts were overpowered by the environment. Cleanliness required resources beyond their reach. When a child fell ill, parents often assumed it was inevitable. Doctors cost money. Remedies were unreliable. Some families relied on old beliefs or makeshift cures, hoping they would ease symptoms long enough for the child to survive. Water supplies were particularly treacherous. Pumps located near cesspools or drainage routes produced water that looked clear but carried deadly bacteria. Children drank from these pumps daily, swallowing contamination with every sip. Adults suspected that the water made them sick, but they had no alternatives. When cholera outbreaks occurred, authorities sometimes blamed the poor for their unclean habits, ignoring the infrastructure that forced these families into constant exposure. The emotional toll of living in such conditions shaped children in subtle but lasting ways. Many developed a deep awareness of discomfort, learning to accept sickness or injury without complaint. They grew used to stepping carefully over filth, maneuvering through puddles that carried disease, and sleeping in rooms where dampness collected on the walls like a second skin. They learned that the world around them was not designed for comfort or safety. The streets themselves served as a kind of grim classroom. Children observed dead animals left to rot, human waste discarded in corners, and piles of refuse that changed shape each day. These sights taught them that survival required constant vigilance. They learned to eat quickly, to avoid flies, to wash with minimal water, and to identify the safest paths through the alleyways. Their instincts developed not around play or curiosity, but around avoiding sickness and navigating decay. When epidemics spread, entire communities mourned quietly. The youngest were often the first to fall. Families continued living in the same rooms where illness had taken hold, unable to relocate or improve their surroundings. Neighbors recognized the signs of an outbreak long before officials did. The sound of coughing behind thin walls, the hurried steps of mothers fetching water, the stillness of a house where a child no longer stirred. Yet despite all this, life continued. Children still walked the streets, still fetched water, still carried out chores. Their acceptance of filth did not come from ignorance but from necessity. Cleanliness was a privilege they could not afford. Survival required adjusting to conditions that would have horrified anyone outside their world. And through it all, society looked on with a detached, distant gaze, acknowledging the existence of these neighborhoods only when disease threatened to spread beyond them. The children remained unseen, except when counted among the statistics of outbreaks, numbers rather than lives, symptoms rather than stories. Everything here reveals how childhood unfolded in places where dirt shaped every decision. What rises from these conditions leads to the struggle for nourishment that defines their daily existence. Meals so thin and hollow left children facing a kind of hunger that pressed deeper than the stomach. Cleanliness for poor Victorian children was not a routine, but a general idea that rarely touched their lives. Bathing required water, warmth, privacy, and time, 4 things that their households rarely possessed. Days passed without a drop of clean water touching their skin. Dirt settled into the folds of their clothing, formed a thin crust across their arms, and darkened the lines of their faces until it became impossible to tell where soot ended and skin began. No one remarked upon it, because filth had become a kind of second skin, familiar and expected. The water they did have access to came from shared pumps or shallow wells, often contaminated by sewage runoff from slaughterhouses or chemicals from nearby factories. Children cupped their hands under these pumps, drinking the same water they used to wash their faces. The sensation of cold, gritty liquid on their skin was the closest many ever came to bathing. Attempts to scrub away dirt usually made little difference. The water carried its own impurities, leaving behind a sticky residue that clung to them long after drying. Bathing indoors was almost unheard of. Families rarely owned tubs, and heating water required fuel they could not waste. On rare occasions, a bucket of water might be warmed over a small fire, only to be shared among several siblings. One child after another would crouch inside the bucket's rim, rinsing themselves with handfuls of murky water that cooled quickly in the drafty rooms. By the time the last child used it, the water had turned cloudy with dirt and ash. Even then, the effort felt precious, something not to be repeated unless necessary. Clothing presented another barrier. Many children owned only one set of clothes worn day and night until the fabric stiffened with sweat and grime. Removing these garments for washing meant having nothing to wear while they dried, so they rarely did. Lice nested in seams. Fleas travelled easily between children who slept close together on straw or bare floors. Scratching became second nature, a physical habit difficult to stop even when skin broke open. The wounds created new vulnerabilities to infection, but the children accepted this without question. Their bodies adjusted to discomfort in ways no child should have needed to learn. Sleep offered little escape. Children without beds made nests of straw rags or discarded cloth scraps gathered from the streets. These makeshift beds soaked up moisture from the ground and trapped dirt beneath the children's bodies. In cold months, frost crept across the floor, numbing their fingers and toes as they shivered through the night. Some curled into corners to avoid drafts. Others lay beneath windows patched with cloth instead of glass, feeling the wind slip through gaps as if the walls themselves were breathing. Rest was shallow, broken by cold or the movement of rats searching for food. Cleanliness became a luxury, not because the children were careless, but because life left no room for it. Work consumed their days and exhaustion consumed their nights. By the time they returned home, their bodies sagged with fatigue. Washing was not something they avoided. It was something they could not afford to think about. Adults offered no reminders, for adults were just as tired. A clean child in the slums was seen as an anomaly, a curiosity, not a standard. Public bathhouses existed in some districts, but they charged fees that no poor family could spare. Even if a child managed to find the money, the facilities were often overcrowded, unsanitary, or reserved for adults. Children watched others wash, but rarely experienced it themselves. The idea of warm water embracing their skin felt like a story belonging to people far removed from their world. The psychological toll of living without cleanliness showed itself slowly. Dirt shaped how children were perceived, how they were treated, and how they learned to view themselves. Some avoided eye contact with wealthier children, embarrassed by the state of their clothes or the smell that clung to them. Others stopped noticing, entirely numbed by repetition. When asked how long it had been since their last bath, many responded with a shrug or silence. Time blurred, days blended. Cleanliness felt like something that happened to other children in other neighborhoods. Illness thrived under these conditions. Skin infections spread easily among siblings. Respiratory problems worsened when children slept in damp clothes. Cuts from work became inflamed because dirt settled into wounds faster than they could heal. Some children carried persistent rashes, while others developed coughs that lasted months. Parents recognized these signs, but had little power to intervene. Remedies required money and cleanliness, two things as rare as comfort. Despite this, the world outside continued to hold impossible expectations. Society judged the poor for their appearance, labeling them lazy or careless, while ignoring the systems that ensured their filth. The contrast between judgment and reality deepened the children's isolation. They learned early that dirt was not just physical. It was a social marker that followed them everywhere. And even as cities expanded, factories grew, and fortunes were made, the children living in these environments remained anchored to a cycle of poverty so entrenched that even the simplest acts of self-care became unattainable. Their lives illustrated a truth that polite society preferred to overlook. Cleanliness was not a matter of discipline, but of privilege. The children who whispered, "I can't remember the last time I had a bath," were not exaggerating. They were speaking the plain truth of lives shaped by scarcity, exhaustion, and neglect. Every detail here shows how living without cleanliness became an ordinary burden for children who never chose it. What emerges from this struggle leads into the fragile world of hunger that shaped their bodies and thoughts. Food so scarce and thin carried consequences that slipped quietly into every part of their lives. Hunger was not an interruption in the lives of poor Victorian children. It was a constant companion that shaped the rhythm of their days. The first thought in the morning and the final ache at night were often the same, an emptiness that never fully disappeared. Their meals were thin shadows of nourishment assembled from whatever scraps a family could gather or afford. Bread that had grown stiff soup, so weak it resembled warm water, and leftovers that carried more worry than flavor, formed the basis of their diet. A child might clutch a piece of stale bread as if it were a treasure, chewing slowly to make the taste last. The bread often crumbled into dry fragments that scratched against the roof of the mouth. Soup, when available, contained little more than broth, a few floating bits of vegetables or thin grease skimmed from someone else's meal. Even this was shared among several siblings, each taking turns with the same spoon. Hunger taught them to eat quickly, but scarcity taught them to savor every drop. Food was rarely eaten warm. Families lacked the fuel needed to heat meals, so children learned to accept cold, unseasoned bites that carried the taste of storage or streets. The sharp, hollow feeling in their stomachs became a normal part of existence. Complaints were rare. Both children and adults knew there was no solution waiting for them. Their bodies adjusted as best they could, but the strain showed in visible ways. Malnutrition revealed itself early. Children's teeth loosened long before adulthood, falling out not from age but from lack of essential nutrients. Their bones grew fragile, bending or breaking under minor pressure. Some walked with unsteady steps, their legs unable to support the weight of daily labor. Hair thinned and fell out, leaving patches of exposed skin on their scalps. Their faces lost softness, replaced by sharp lines and hollow cheeks that made them look older than they were. Illness found easy entry through these weaknesses. A simple cold could become a fever that lingered for weeks. A cut that should have healed quickly turned infected. Their immune systems, starved of strength, resisted little. Hunger weakened not just their bodies but their concentration, making it harder to work, think, or even stand still for long periods without growing dizzy. Some children fainted in the streets, waking only when someone splashed water on their faces. Markets offered reminders of what they could not have. The smell of roasted meat or fresh fruit drifted through the air, but these items were far beyond their reach. Instead, many children hovered at the edges of stalls, waiting for accidents: a dropped apple, a bruised carrot, a torn bag of flour. Sellers often chased them away, shouting or brandishing sticks. But hunger overpowered pride. Children returned to search through discarded scraps, hoping to find something edible before rats or stray dogs reached it first. For some, even scraps were too rare. They learned to scavenge from rubbish heaps, sifting through piles of waste for potato skins, bones with traces of meat, or crusts others had thrown away. The filth never deterred them. Hunger blurred the line between disgust and necessity. Their small hands moved quickly, selecting items with an instinct sharpened by desperation. A day when they found something substantial was considered fortunate. Begging became another path for survival. Children begged outside bakeries, hoping for crumbs that fell from carts, or the kindness of someone who had more than they needed. Most passers-by kept their eyes forward, pretending not to hear the soft voices calling out for food. Those who responded often gave the smallest leftovers pieces, barely large enough to ease the ache. Still, the children accepted them gratefully. In their world, any amount of food was a victory. The emotional effects of hunger were subtler, but just as damaging. Children learned to hoard food, hiding crumbs in pockets or folds of clothing, even when the food had no value left. They developed habits of eating silently, guarding their meals against siblings who were just as desperate. Arguments over small portions broke out often, though the guilt that followed lingered long after the hunger returned. Sharing was an ideal they admired but rarely could afford. Parents battled their own despair as they watched their children shrink under the weight of hunger. Some skipped meals so their children could eat a little more. Others pretended they were full just to avoid dividing food further. But these gestures could not change the larger truth: poverty made hunger an unyielding condition. Adults felt the same pain as the children, but they understood more deeply that no amount of sacrifice could mend the gap between need and available resources. Festive seasons or holidays offered little relief. While wealthier families celebrated with roasted meats, sweet puddings, or fruit pies, poor children watched through windows or listened from the streets. Their own homes remained quiet, the air heavy with the familiar smell of boiled water and stale bread. Holidays for them were not about abundance, but about enduring another day without enough to eat. The environment itself contributed to the struggle. Cold winters intensified the need for nourishment, yet food was scarcest during these months. Children burned energy trying to stay warm, shivering through long nights that deepened their exhaustion. Summer brought rotting waste and spoiled food, creating additional dangers. Hunger was not merely a lack of food. It was a cycle that shifted with the seasons, relentless in every form. Nothing shaped their understanding of the world more powerfully than the daily search for something to eat. Hunger became a language they spoke without words, a constant reminder of the limitations that defined their lives. It carved itself into their posture, their movement, and the way they looked at anything resembling food. And through it all, society continued to speak of progress, industry, and prosperity ideas that carried little meaning for children who counted their days by the thinness of their meals. Everything described here shows how hunger shaped their bodies long before life had the chance to shape their futures. What rises from this emptiness leads into the harsh discipline waiting in homes and schools alike. Punishment delivered with cold precision left scars that stretched far beyond bruises. Discipline for poor Victorian children came in forms that rarely resembled guidance. It arrived as blows, orders, and cold reprimands delivered by adults whose own lives were pressed thin by hardship. Violence seeped into both the home and the classroom, forming an unbroken chain of severity that shaped how children learned to move, speak, and even think. For many of them, the world was not divided into safe places and dangerous ones. The threat followed them everywhere. Home should have offered shelter, yet it often mirrored the harshness of the streets outside. Parents, worn down by endless labor and chronic hunger, carried frustrations that had nowhere to go. These frustrations settled into their bones and spilled out in sudden bursts. A child who returned late, broke a tool, or cried from exhaustion risked being struck before they could explain themselves. The punishments ranged from slaps to beatings with belts, sticks, or whatever lay close at hand. Children rarely protested. They understood, even without words, that adults were trapped by circumstances that bent their tempers into rigid, brittle forms. A violent outburst was not always personal. Sometimes it was the only way an adult could assert control in a life defined by powerlessness. Yet the effect on children was the same. Bruises marked their arms, backs, and legs. Silence became their safest defense. For some, school offered a brief escape from the noise of the home, but the discipline there was even more unforgiving. Victorian classrooms demanded perfect obedience, and punishment became the primary method of enforcing it. Teachers carried canes, rulers, leather straps, and occasionally thin rods made from birch. These tools rested on desks or hung visibly on walls as warnings. Children learned to sit upright and still, not because they understood the lesson, but because movement invited pain. Errors in writing, slow reading, or failure to memorize were treated not as learning struggles, but as moral failings. A child whose handwriting wavered could be struck across the knuckles until their fingers swelled. Some fainted from pain, but fainting itself was considered misbehavior. Teachers dragged the unconscious child upright or splashed cold water on their face before continuing the lesson. The goal was not improvement, it was submission. The sound of punishment became part of the school's atmosphere. The sharp snap of a cane, the muffled cry of a pupil trying not to scream, the quick shuffle of feet as children attempted to shrink into their benches. These noises blended into the rhythm of each day, punctuating lessons with reminders of the consequences of failure. The classroom's order came at the price of fear, and that fear seeped deeply into the children's understanding of authority. Some punishments pursued humiliation rather than pain. A child might be made to stand in a corner with a dunce cap, their peers whispering behind them. Others were forced to kneel on hard floors for long stretches, their legs numb and their backs aching. Schools justified these practices as necessary discipline, insisting that they molded character. In reality, they taught children that their worthiness hinged on obedience, not understanding. Violence at school compounded what children experienced at home. A child beaten for writing poorly might return to a house where their parents scolded them for coming home too slowly. The overlap between these environments created a cycle from which there was no pause. Physical pain dulled eventually, but the dread lingered, an awareness that mistakes, even innocent ones, could unleash consequences far beyond their control. Some children suffered injuries that lasted for life. Arms broken during punishments healed crookedly. Scars lined their backs where rods had torn skin. Those struck on the head developed lasting headaches or vision problems, yet these injuries rarely elicited sympathy. Adults saw them as evidence of necessary correction. Children learned to hide their wounds or lie about them. Admission meant additional scolding or worse accusations of dishonesty. Teachers themselves often acted out of fear or pressure. Overcrowded classrooms and limited resources made teaching nearly impossible. Discipline became the only tool they felt capable of wielding. For many teachers, especially those from poor backgrounds, maintaining authority was a matter of survival. If they appeared weak, they risked losing their position to someone more severe. Violence became a language they believed they had to speak. Despite everything, children kept attending school when they could. Some wanted to learn, believing education might offer a path out of poverty. Others were sent only because laws or charities required it. Regardless of their reasons, they faced the same rigid system. Even the brightest children learned that excellence did not protect them entirely. One moment of inattention or one smudged letter could erase months of careful work. Homes offered no relief for mistakes made at school. Parents told by teachers that their child misbehaved often applied their own punishments at home. The same error earned two sets of consequences, first from the teacher, then from the parent. For children, this created a world where the smallest misstep spiraled into a cascade of pain. Their days became exercises in caution, not curiosity. Violence shaped how they perceived adulthood. Instead of seeing grown-ups as guides, they saw them as figures who demanded endurance. Affection was scarce, replaced by warnings and orders. Children learned to measure safety, not by presence, but by silence. A quiet adult meant no immediate danger. A frustrated one meant they should prepare for harm. Over time, the emotional effects embedded themselves deeply. Some children flinched reflexively at sudden movements. Others spoke softly, afraid their voices might attract attention. Many grew into adults who carried the same patterns forward, believing harshness was the only effective means of control. The cycle repeated because it felt familiar. Underneath the surface of Victorian progress, beneath the polished manners and moral lectures, countless children navigated lives where punishment overshadowed guidance. The world praised discipline as a virtue, while ignoring the suffering it caused. Children were expected to endure without complaint, their bruises dismissed as ordinary signs of growth. But their bodies remembered everything. Everything shown here reveals how punishment shaped children long before they understood why they were hurt. What rises from these injuries leads to the systems that claim to educate while tightening their restrictions. Rules wrapped in authority created spaces where control mattered far more than learning. School for poor Victorian children was less a place of learning and more a controlled space where order outweighed purpose. The buildings that served as classrooms were often converted warehouses, abandoned chapels, or cramped upper floors above shops, where the smell of smoke and damp wood clung to the walls. Light struggled to enter through narrow windows coated with grime, creating dim rooms where children sat in rows, their backs stiff, waiting for commands rather than instruction. The desks were small and unforgiving, designed not for comfort but compliance. Children squeezed into them shoulder to shoulder, hardly able to move without brushing against someone else. Most could not read or write well enough to follow the lessons, yet they were expected to sit in rigid silence for hours. The slightest fidget drew the teacher's gaze. A dropped pencil could result in warnings. A whisper could bring punishment. The room functioned like a holding cell disguised as a school. Teachers enforced strict discipline, not because they believed it improved learning, but because they were told it kept chaos away. Many of them lacked proper training, stepping into their roles with little more than authority and frustration. They saw their pupils not as children growing toward knowledge, but as stubborn beings needing constant correction. Education became secondary to restraint. A teacher's success was measured not by what students understood, but by how silent the room remained. For children who were already exhausted from morning labor or long walks through crowded streets, obedience was difficult. Fatigue made their heads droop. Hunger weakened their limbs, yet no allowances existed for tiredness or illness. If a child's eyelids sagged, they were struck lightly on the back of the head. If they slumped, they were ordered to stand at the front of the room exposed to their classmates' stares. The message was simple. Failing to meet expectations regardless of reason deserved correction. Punishments ranged from harsh to humiliating. Some children were forced to stand on stools for extended periods, their legs trembling as they attempted to maintain balance. Others were tied to benches or posts with rough ropes that chafed their skin. A common punishment involved dragging a child outside and making them stand in the cold, facing the wall of the building, while icy wind seeped through their thin clothing. Those who cried were mocked for weakness. Those who stayed silent were assumed to have learned a lesson. The atmosphere inside the classroom grew heavier each time punishment was carried out. Children flinched when the teacher moved suddenly. They watched the cane or strap resting on the desk, aware that any mistake could bring it down upon them. Even the sound of footsteps approaching the classroom door stiffened their bodies. Learning required curiosity, but curiosity could not survive in a place where fear filled every corner. The lessons themselves were mechanical. Children recited letters, repeated passages, or copied sentences they barely understood. The goal was memorization, not comprehension. Those who learned slowly were treated as problems to be fixed, not individuals who needed patience. When they failed to keep up, they were separated from their peers and placed in the punishment corner, sometimes wearing boards hung around their necks with words like lazy or slow. The shame embedded itself deeply, shaping how they viewed themselves long after the school day ended. Some children attended school only intermittently, their families needing them to work. When these children returned after absences, they were punished for falling behind. Teachers accused them of disrespecting education, ignoring the reality that survival took priority over schooling. The harshness of the classroom seemed especially sharp for these children who arrived already burdened by labor and were met with anger rather than understanding. The physical environment also contributed to the sense of imprisonment. Classrooms were cold in winter, the air so frigid that children's breath misted as they recited lessons. Their fingers stiffened, making writing painful. Ink froze in inkwells, and the few coal stoves provided barely enough warmth for those sitting closest to them. In summer, the air turned thick and suffocating, carrying the scent of sweat and damp wood. Flies buzzed around the windows. Children fought faintness, while teachers demanded attention. Despite these conditions, society praised education as a moral duty. They spoke of schooling as an opportunity for the poor to lift themselves, ignoring that the system offered little true knowledge and much suffering. Adults pointed to classrooms as symbols of progress. Yet inside those rooms, children learned more about fear than letters. They learned that authority was absolute, that silence protected them more than understanding, and that mistakes were dangerous. Teachers justified their methods by insisting that strict discipline prepared children for the real world. In truth, the system reflected the beliefs of an era that valued order over care. Schools became extensions of the factories and workhouses, training children to obey without question. A quiet classroom reassured adults outside the school walls, offering the illusion that poor children were being shaped into respectable citizens. Some children did manage to learn, despite these obstacles. They clung to scraps of knowledge, memorizing letters late at night, or tracing words in the dirt when no one was watching. But even these small victories came with difficulty. Their achievements were not nurtured. They were merely tolerated. Encouragement was rare, and praise almost unheard of. A child who succeeded often did so quietly, afraid that drawing attention would lead to more expectations and therefore more chances to fail. As the school day ended, children left the building with stiff limbs and heavy minds. They returned home knowing that the next day would bring more of the same. For many, school did not feel like an escape from hardship. It felt like another version of it. The idea of learning as joy never entered their world. Education was an obligation, a requirement enforced by adults who believed strictness was the same as care. What remained after years in such a system were memories etched in tension. The cold bench, the sting of a strap, the sound of another child crying quietly into their sleeves. And behind those memories lingered the understanding that classrooms built to enlighten had instead become places of control. Everything described here shows how schooling shaped obedience rather than understanding for children who needed compassion most. What emerges from this rigid world leads to the struggle for basic materials that many could only dream of. Books worn thin and borrowed in secrecy became symbols of hope wrapped in scarcity. Books were objects that carried a weight far heavier than their pages for poor Victorian children. Most of them grew up without ever owning one, let alone touching a clean, well-kept volume. In their neighborhoods, books were not seen as everyday tools, but as rare possessions belonging to families who had the space, time, and stability to protect them. Knowledge lived behind closed doors, while poor children stood outside peering in from the cold. A child who wanted to learn had to rely on whatever scraps of paper they could find. Torn pages from discarded newspapers, fragments ripped from old ledgers, or sheets used to wrap goods were gathered carefully and treated almost as treasures. These leftovers carried stains, smudges, or traces of the items they once wrapped, such as fish, soot, candles, or bread. Yet children traced the faded letters with their fingers, trying to memorize shapes they barely understood. Borrowing a book was an even greater ordeal. Families who owned books guarded them tightly, fearing damage or theft. Occasionally, a child might convince a neighbor or a distant relative to lend a single volume, usually a tattered school primer or a children's reader whose spine had begun to split. The pages felt fragile, threatening to tear with the slightest pressure. Children turned them slowly, holding their breath as though the entire object might crumble in their hands. Many children never got this close. Instead, they learned from a distance. Outside certain schoolrooms or charity halls, they stood on crates or leaned against walls, watching through windows as lessons took place inside. They listened to the teacher's voice, muffled by glass, trying to catch the shape of each word. Sometimes frost clouded the panes, hiding the chalkboard completely. Still, they stayed, hoping that a fragment of a sentence or the outline of a letter might stay in their minds long enough to repeat later. Children who attempted to learn this way often drew unwanted attention. Adults passing by questioned why a child loitered near a window. Some accused them of mischief, others of idleness. A few teachers chased them away, insisting that lessons were not meant for those who had not paid. And so the children moved further back, hiding behind crates or corners, continuing to listen even when they could barely hear the lesson. For the poorest families, knowledge competed directly with hunger. A child who asked for a book knew that the money required to buy one could instead purchase bread. Parents often reminded their children of this, gently or harshly depending on the day's mood. "We cannot eat letters," some said. Others simply handed their children crumbs and expected them to understand. And the children did understand. In a world that demanded survival, above all else, learning felt like an indulgence they did not deserve. Charity schools occasionally offered materials, but these came with limitations. Books were shared among dozens of students, passed from one pair of trembling hands to another. Pages became soft from wear, margins filled with scribbles from children who had used the book before. Ink stains smudged text. When lessons ended, the teacher collected every volume, locking them in cabinets so none could be lost or taken home. For most children, the brief moment during class was the only time they ever touched a real book. Writing was another barrier. Owning a pencil was a luxury, and ink was even more unreachable. Children improvised with charcoal, broken chalk, or sharpened sticks dipped in water mixed with soot. Their writing surfaces were scraps of paper, flattened pieces of cardboard, or even patches of dirt on the ground. Rain erased their work. Wind carried it away. Still, they persisted, repeating letters until their fingers blackened with dust. Some learned to draw letters on walls, pressing their fingertips against bricks or wooden planks to feel the shapes. These gestures, though small, represented enormous determination. But society did not admire their effort. To many adults, a poor child practicing writing was a curiosity at best and a nuisance at worst. Some children were scolded for wasting time. Others were punished for drawing on walls that did not belong to them. The divide between children who had access to books and those who did not grew wider with each passing year. In wealthier districts, children learned to read by touching crisp pages, guided by parents or tutors who corrected their posture and pronunciation. They wrote with clean ink on sturdy paper and were praised for their progress. Meanwhile, poor children clung to scraps, squinted through windows, and memorized lessons spoken to other children. This contrast reinforced a painful truth. Education was not designed to lift the poor, but to remind them of their place. Knowledge was framed as a privilege, not a right. Adults insisted that learning was important, yet the system denied books to those who needed them most. Letters became symbols of exclusion, marking who belonged in respectable society and who did not. Even when poor children managed to learn a few words or sentences, the world around them gave little encouragement. Factories demanded labor, not literacy. Employers valued obedience over understanding. A child who read too much might even attract suspicion, as though knowledge itself were an act of defiance. And so, despite their efforts, many children learned only enough to survive the expectations placed upon them. Still, the desire to learn did not disappear. It flickered like a small flame inside those who continued watching through windows or gathering scraps. That longing made each rare moment with a book feel sacred. The smell of old paper, the rough texture of torn edges, the faded ink, everything mattered. These children sensed that books held answers, even if they could not reach them fully. Their world measured value through food and labor, yet they understood instinctively that knowledge once gained stayed with them longer than bread. It did not fill their stomachs, but it filled something else, something that hunger could not erode. Everything revealed here shows how knowledge became both a hope and a burden, for children denied the tools to reach it. What forms from this longing leads into the homes where filth and infestation shape their nightly rest. Creatures crawling in the dark created a world where sleep offered no safety at all. For poor Victorian children, nighttime offered no peace. The moment the daylight slipped away and the small rooms turned dim, another world awoke around them, one made of crawling, scratching and biting. Their homes, often built from decaying wood and patched bricks, gave shelter not only to families, but to countless insects and rodents that thrived in the dark. Sleep became less an escape and more a slow negotiation with discomfort. Beds were rare, and mattresses rarer still. Many children slept on piles of rags, straw or cloth remnants collected from the streets. These materials trapped moisture and dirt, attracting insects that hid deep within the folds. Bedbugs crawled across the fabric, waiting for warmth and stillness. The moment a child lay down, the insects emerged, biting along arms, necks and legs. The bites left clusters of red marks that itched intensely and often bled when scratched. Children grew accustomed to waking during the night, to the sensation of insects moving across their skin. Some learned not to react, knowing that flinching or brushing them away only made the bites worse. Others curled into themselves, pulling their thin clothing tightly around their bodies in a futile attempt to create a barrier. Yet bedbugs slipped through seams, appearing in places no child could protect. The walls and floors were alive, with movement as well. Cracks beneath door frames and gaps between floorboards became pathways for cockroaches and fleas. Cockroaches scattered suddenly when a candle was lit, leaving behind trails that glistened faintly under the weak light. Fleas jumped from straw bedding onto children's clothes, burrowing into skin with relentless persistence. Their bites swelled quickly, creating welts that burned and scabbed over, never fully healing before fresh ones appeared. Rats posed an even greater threat. They travelled in groups, bold and unafraid, searching for crumbs or scraps left behind from the day. Their teeth gnawed through wood cloth and sometimes even the fingers of sleeping children who unknowingly blocked their path. A child could awake in terror, feeling a sharp sting, only to find a rat disappearing into the shadows. Some children screamed. Others learned to bite their lips and remain quiet, knowing noise might anger adults who were too exhausted to respond gently. Injuries from rat bites often led to infections. Without access to clean water or medicine, wounds grew red and swollen, oozing pus and spreading pain through the limb. Some children's hands or feet became so infected that they lost the ability to walk or grip tools. In the worst cases, the infection spreads quickly through the body. Fever followed, then delirium. A few died quietly during the night, their parents waking to stillness rather than the usual scratching in the walls. Girls faced additional dangers in these living conditions. Filth accumulated in the cramped rooms, mixing with moisture from leaking roofs and spilled water. The constant exposure to dirt, mold, and contaminated surfaces caused infections that young girls could not understand or explain. Discomfort and pain became normal for them, yet they rarely spoke of it, knowing there were no remedies available and no privacy to address their discomfort. These infections sometimes became severe, silently shaping their health for years to come. The smell inside the homes was a blend of damp wood, dirty clothing, and the lingering presence of animals that came and went as they pleased. Children breathed this air every day. Mold clung to walls in dark patches that grew larger after each rain. Food scraps left for a single night disappeared beneath clusters of insects by morning. The houses were not simply unclean. They were environments where survival depended on learning to coexist with creatures that treated the children's bodies as part of the landscape. Parents tried to fight back against the infestations, but their tools were limited. They swept floors with homemade brooms that barely moved the dirt. They shook bedding outside in the cold watching, as bugs scattered only to return later. Some burned small piles of herbs or cloth, hoping the smoke would drive pests away, but it only filled the room with another layer of choking air. The infestations were relentless, and fatigue eventually outweighed the desire to resist. Children carried the marks of these nights into their days. Their arms bore lines of scratches. Their ankles swelled from clusters of bites. Some walked with limps from infected wounds. Teachers and employers rarely cared. Injuries were seen as signs of poor upbringing, rather than evidence of impossible living conditions. Judgment came quickly, understanding never. The psychological toll etched itself quietly into the children's minds. Nights filled with crawling insects and lurking rats taught them that darkness meant danger. Many developed habits of staying half awake, listening to every noise, and being prepared to flinch at the slightest movement. Some refused to sleep alone, crowding together for small comfort, even though sharing space meant sharing more bites and more risk. Despite everything, the children learned to endure. Endurance was not a choice but a condition of their lives. They rose each morning from bedding alive, with insects brushed dirt from their arms, and stepped into their day as though these hardships were natural. They rarely spoke of their nights. Silence became a fragile form of survival. And through it all, the world outside celebrated Victorian order progress and civility ideas that hovered far above the rooms where children lay awake, listening to the scurrying of creatures waiting for their next chance at food or warmth. Everything shown here reveals how nights shaped children long before daylight returned, leaving marks no one cared to notice. What rises from these restless hours leads into the streets, where even shelter became uncertain. Lives spent outdoors unfolded under skies that offered no mercy at all. Homelessness for Victorian children was not an abrupt fall, but a slow slide into a life where the streets became their only constant. After the Industrial Revolution reshaped cities, countless children found themselves without parents, relatives, or anyone willing to claim them. Some were orphaned by disease, others abandoned because their families could no longer feed them, and many slipped through the cracks of a society too overwhelmed to care. The streets, with all their noise and coldness, became their reluctant guardians. Nights were the hardest. When darkness settled over the city, children searched for places that offered even the faintest barrier against wind and rain. Some huddled under shop awnings, pressing their backs against wooden walls to shield themselves from drafts. Others crept into churchyards lying between cold stones or near burial sites where the earth was slightly raised. A few found shelter in empty stables, curling beside rotting straw that still held traces of warmth from animals long gone. The ground was always cold. Even in summer, stone pavements pulled heat away from their bodies. In winter, frost coated the streets, turning every breath into a small cloud of misery. Children wrapped their arms around themselves, trying to keep warm beneath thin, tattered clothing. Their fingers stiffened, their toes numbed until they lost feeling entirely. Sleep came in brief, restless intervals, never deep, always interrupted by shivers or sudden noises. Mornings offered little relief. Children rose slowly, their bodies aching from the hard surfaces they had slept on. Some brushed dirt from their clothes, or wiped mud from their faces, using the edges of their sleeves. Others shook leaves, insects, or bits of straw from their hair. Then, with no home to return to, and no one expecting them, they began the daily search for survival. Begging became their primary method of finding food. They wandered through markets, approaching people carrying baskets or parcels, their voices soft from fatigue. Some passers-by ignored them. Others scolded them for loitering. A handful tossed them crumbs or leftover pieces of bread. The children accepted whatever they received, grateful, even for scraps that might once have been thrown away. Hunger made every gesture significant. They competed silently with dogs, rats, and other children, scanning the ground for anything edible. Potato skins, bread crusts, bruised apples, and wilted vegetables became precious discoveries. Markets, though full of life and noise, held constant danger as well. Shopkeepers chased them with sticks. Guards pushed them away from the stalls. Even other hungry children fought fiercely over the same discarded pieces of food. Water came from public pumps or puddles left by rain. Pumps provided slightly more safety, though the water was often contaminated by sewage flowing through nearby drains. Still, children drank quickly, cupping their hands and hoping the water would ease the ache in their stomachs. During droughts, puddles became their only option, leaving them dehydrated and vulnerable to illness. Finding safety was an even greater challenge. Streets belonged to adults at night, drunken workers, thieves, and men searching for trouble. Children learned to remain unnoticed, hiding in doorways or under carts. They slept in shifts, taking turns, keeping watch. Older children protected younger ones when they could, but loyalty was a fragile thing in a world built on scarcity. Fear taught them to distrust strangers, yet loneliness pushed them toward each other. Police and city officials viewed homeless children as nuisances. They were arrested for loitering, begging, or sleeping in prohibited areas. Many were dragged to workhouses or detention centers where harsh discipline awaited them. Some ran away the moment they were released. Others stayed only because they were too weak to resist. The streets felt cruel, but the institutions meant to reform them offered little more than punishment. Exposure to the elements gradually shaped their bodies. Constant cold weakened their lungs, making coughs linger for months. Wet clothing caused infections. Cuts from sharp cobblestones or broken glass healed, slowly becoming inflamed without proper care. Some children carried permanent scars, reminders of nights they had survived by chance. Others did not survive at all, collapsing in alleys where no one noticed until morning. Friendship offered brief comfort. Small groups formed out of necessity rather than affection. Children shared scraps, watched for danger, or rested in circles for warmth. But these bonds rarely lasted long. Hunger, illness, and arrests fractured groups repeatedly. The street taught them that stability was a luxury they could not expect. Despite everything, moments of childhood occasionally slipped through the cracks. A child might laugh while kicking a stone along the sidewalk. Another might chase a stray dog for a few steps. These glimpses of innocence faded quickly, replaced by the weight of their circumstances. The city did not allow childhood to linger. It demanded vigilance, endurance, and silence. Night after night, children returned to the same cold streets, knowing they would wake again with the same hunger, the same aches, and the same uncertainty. Passers-by saw them as shadows, part of the landscape easily overlooked. To the city's more comfortable residents, these children blended into the noise and movement of urban life. Their suffering was invisible not because it was small, but because people chose not to see it. Under the smoke-filled sky of Victorian cities, homeless children learned to survive in ways no child should. Their lives unfolded on pavements in alleys and beneath abandoned roofs, spaces that held no warmth, no safety, and no sense of belonging. Yet these children persisted, navigating each day with a resilience born not from hope but from necessity. Everything described here reveals how the streets shaped children into quiet survivors, long before anyone noticed their struggle. What grows from this wandering existence leads into far darker corners, where exploitation replaces neglect. Young lives pushed into hidden rooms, exposed to cruelty deeper than hunger or cold. For poor Victorian children, danger did not always roar. Sometimes it arrived quietly, wrapped in promises of shelter, food, or work. Families struggling to survive often faced impossible choices, and children became the first casualties of desperation. Homes collapsed under the weight of poverty, leaving young girls in particular exposed to forces that operated in the shadows of respectable society. These forces took children not to factories or workshops, but to rooms where innocence became a commodity. Many of the establishments that trapped these children disguised themselves as boarding houses, sewing workshops, or places offering domestic employment. Behind their doors, however, the reality was starkly different. Girls were brought in with the assurance that they would be fed and clothed. Some believed they would work as maids. Others were told they would assist with small household tasks. But once inside, they found that the exit was harder to reach than the entrance. The rules changed. Their movements were restricted. The air shifted, and childhood receded further than ever. The girls were often painfully young, some barely 9 or 10, still small enough to be mistaken for toddlers when wrapped in oversized clothing. They had grown up hungry and worn, making them appear frail no matter their age. Their vulnerability made them targets, Adults with power and money knew that no one would ask questions about a poor child who vanished from the streets. In neighborhoods overflowing with suffering, disappearance blended seamlessly into everyday tragedy. Inside these hidden rooms, the children lived under constant supervision. Windows were blocked or nailed shut, doors locked from the outside. Some rooms held multiple girls, each one watching the others, with hollow eyes that betrayed exhaustion deeper than physical fatigue. They were given just enough food to keep them weak but alive. The adults controlling the establishment enforced silence, creating an atmosphere where even crying felt dangerous. The girls learned quickly that resistance carried consequences. A raised voice, a plea for help, or even hesitation in following instructions resulted in punishments that left no room for defiance. Their world became a sequence of demands and fears, carried out under the threat of further harm. The children had no protective laws to rely on, no authority willing to intervene. Victorian society valued appearances, and these hidden rooms existed quietly beneath polished facades that no one challenged. The customers who visited these places came from various walks of life. Men who wore fine coats, men who lectured publicly about morality, and men who passed the poor on the street without offering a glance. They stepped into these rooms without shame, confident that no one would expose them. The children had no names for these men, no identities worth acknowledging. They were treated as objects shaped by desperation, not as individuals with futures once imagined. Some girls attempted to escape. They tried unlocking windows or sneaking out when the door cracked open. But the adults who ran these establishments were practiced in containment. Attempts were met with harsh reactions meant to frighten not just the one who tried, but everyone else who witnessed it. Fear spread quickly, tightening its grip around the children's remaining hope. Illness followed them into these rooms. The combination of poor hygiene, malnutrition, and confinement weakened their bodies. Fevers festered without treatment. Infections went unnoticed until they became severe. Some girls grew too sick to move, collapsing on thin bedding that smelled of dust and damp. Instead of receiving care, they were pushed aside, their frail forms left in corners, while others continued living under the same oppressive routine. A few died quietly, their bodies removed without ceremony. Outside, the world attributed these disappearances to poverty, vice, or the children themselves. Newspapers occasionally printed brief stories hinting at wrongdoing, but the accusations faded quickly. Evidence was scarce, and few officials had an interest in investigating. Victorian law offered little protection to poor children, especially girls. The authorities rarely intervened unless a scandal threatened to spill into the public eye, and even then the consequences for the perpetrators were fleeting. The children had no voice strong enough to contend with the indifference surrounding them. The emotional weight carried by these children shaped them in ways that could not be seen from the outside. Fear settled into their movements. Silence became a habit they clung to. Even when they later found chances to escape, or were released after becoming too ill to be profitable, the scars remained invisible but undeniable. Trust became difficult. Safety felt temporary. The future seemed like a concept built for others, not for them. Some girls never returned to the streets because they did not survive their captivity. Their absence barely caused a ripple. Victorian cities were too crowded, too chaotic, too burdened by poverty for such losses to disrupt the rhythm of daily life. Their names disappeared from memory long before anyone noticed they were gone. The cruelty of these hidden rooms reflected a society that professed moral strictness, while allowing exploitation to thrive in its shadow. Respectability functioned as a mask. Behind it, children suffered in silence, their youth consumed by adults who valued their own desires above human decency. These girls were not lost to chance. They were taken by a system that saw them as expendable. And while the world outside continued its routines, these children remained trapped in spaces where hope flickered faintly, if at all. Everything revealed here shows how hidden rooms stole away young lives long before help could find them. What forms from this cruelty lead into the institutions claiming to act for the children's benefit? Places designed for reform carried their own brand of hardship, waiting behind fortified doors. Play was a luxury that poor Victorian children learned to abandon early. In their world, free time was not a natural part of childhood, but an indulgence reserved for families who could afford to let their children rest. For those born into poverty, every moment was measured by usefulness. Adults watched them closely, expecting small hands to work, fetch, scrub, or carry. Anything that resembled leisure drew suspicion, as though joy itself were an offense. Most children accepted this expectation long before they understood it. Their days began with chores and ended with more chores. They carried water from pumps, swept narrow floors, sorted scraps in workshops, or watched younger siblings while parents worked late. Hours passed with repetition, leaving little space for imagination. When a child paused to look at clouds or trace patterns in dirt, adults often snapped at them to stay focused. A wandering mind was considered a waste. Even the idea of playtime felt distant. In working-class neighborhoods, laughter could be mistaken for laziness. If a group of children gathered in an alley to chase each other or invent games, adults might intervene sharply, fearing the noise would attract trouble or distract others from their responsibilities. A loud shout or burst of laughter could result in punishment. Children learned to hold joy quietly if they held it at all. Toys were almost non-existent. A child who wanted something to play with had to improvise. Broken sticks became swords or imaginary tools. Stones became objects to collect or targets to toss. Shards of wood, bottle caps, and bits of fabric found in the street served as prized possessions. Children guarded these small treasures as though they held real value, because in their world they did. These objects offered brief moments of escape from the constant demands of labor. Games were simple, shaped by what the streets provided. Children drew lines in dust for skipping patterns or tossed pebbles with careful concentration. Even these small joys carried risks. A parent might scold a child for dirtying their clothes. A passerby might kick away the stones and tell them to stop blocking the path. Older children, hardened by responsibility, sometimes mocked younger ones for wasting time. The pressure to grow up left little room to be young. Some children found ways to play in secret. They waited until adults' backs were turned or until night fell and chores were done. In dim corners or behind buildings, they created small stories or shared jokes in hushed voices. The laughter that escaped them sounded quick and nervous, as if it needed permission to exist. These moments lasted only until someone approached, and the children returned immediately to silence. Play was more than entertainment. It was a brief reminder that they were still children. But society refused to acknowledge this. Adults insisted that working-class children needed discipline, not amusement. They believed play encouraged irresponsibility. That belief shaped the way children saw themselves. Some grew ashamed of wanting to play, feeling guilty for moments of happiness that did not contribute to survival. Others buried the desire entirely, replacing curiosity with caution. In this environment, children's bodies aged quickly. Their movements became purposeful, their expressions serious. They learned not to run unless necessary, not to draw attention, not to imagine themselves in roles beyond what the world demanded of them. The absence of play left them without a safe outlet for stress or fear. Many carried tension in their shoulders and jaws long before they understood what worry was. Children from wealthier families played freely in parks or nurseries supervised by adults who believed play was essential for development. Toys crafted from wood, metal, or cloth filled their rooms. Books described games meant to stimulate learning. Their laughter filled gardens and streets without reprimand. This contrast deepened the divide between classes not only in wealth and opportunity, but in the very definition of what childhood could be. Poor children saw glimpses of this other world from afar. They watched from alleyways as privileged children rolled hoops, tossed bright balls, or pulled small toy carts. The sight sparked envy or longing emotions quickly suppressed because they served no purpose. These children returned to their tasks carrying water or sweeping steps, knowing that no one would hand them a toy or grant them time to rest. The denial of play shaped the way they learned to perceive joy. Many grew suspicious of moments that felt too light, too easy. Life had taught them that happiness carried consequences. Others became adept at finding small pleasures in ordinary objects. The sound of pebbles rolling across stone, the warmth of sunlight on their hands, the way dust lifted into the air when they scratched patterns into the ground. These were not toys, but they became substitutes for the wonders they were denied. In homes that measured worth by labor, children learned to hide their wants. They tucked away their small treasures, sharing them only with trusted siblings or friends. A bit of string became a jumping rope. A discarded tin became a drum. The creativity required to build these moments was remarkable, yet the world never recognized it. Instead, it insisted that children were meant for work, not joy. Punishments for play could be severe. A child laughing too loudly might be slapped or ordered to stand still for long periods. Adults believed such measures prevented misbehavior. In truth, they taught children that joy was dangerous. This lesson carved itself deeply into their understanding of life. Even as adults, many carried a quiet discomfort with relaxation shaped by childhoods where play was equated with disobedience. And in the dim rooms where poor families lived in the narrow streets filled with smoke and noise, childhood slipped away without ceremony. Play, the essence of youth, faded under the weight of necessity. What remained were children shaped by labor silence and the constant pressure to grow up faster than their bodies or minds were ready to. Everything shared here reveals how joy became something children learned to hide rather than express. What grows from this loss leads into the graveyards, where small lives ended long before they had a chance to unfold. Markers, worn by weather, told stories that no one wanted to read. Child mortality in Victorian cities cast a long shadow over the lives of poor families. For children who already struggled with hunger, illness, and dangerous labor, the line between life and death was thin from the very beginning. Many entered the world already weakened by their mother's exhaustion and malnutrition. Others survived only a few months before the disease swept through cramped rooms, claiming the smallest bodies first. Death was not a rare tragedy, but a familiar presence that visited families repeatedly. Few homes escaped loss. A cough that lingered too long, a fever that spiked overnight, or a small wound that turned infected, each carried the potential to end a child's life. Parents watched their children closely, not out of overprotection, but out of fear. They recognized the hollow look in the eyes, the stillness in breath, the sudden quiet that signaled something was wrong. By the time help arrived, if it arrived at all, it was often too late. Medicine was scarce, doctors expensive, and cleanliness beyond reach. Diseases moved quickly through neighborhoods, where pipes leaked sewage onto streets, and water sources carried contamination. Cholera, typhoid, diphtheria, and measles struck repeatedly, preying on weakened immune systems. Children already worn down by labor stood little chance. Their bodies, deprived of rest and nourishment, collapsed under the strain. Some families lost one child after another, burying each loss with a kind of numb resignation forced upon them by necessity. Workplace accidents claimed many more. Factories hired children because their small bodies fit easily between machines. But those same machines snagged clothing, crushed fingers, or pulled children into gears before anyone could react. Mine tunnels collapsed. Chimney flues trapped young workers in spaces so tight that panic alone could suffocate them. Families identified bodies by scraps of clothing or bruises that had not yet faded. Their grief became another task to manage. Because so many children died, young entire cemeteries were dedicated to them. These burial grounds stood on the edges of cities, often hidden behind iron fences or stone walls darkened by soot. The soil, disturbed, constantly settled unevenly over the small graves. Some markers leaned to one side, others had been reduced to fragments by weather and time. Many graves bore no names at all, only wooden stakes or small stones placed by grieving parents who lacked the money for a proper marker. Walking through these cemeteries, one could see rows of tiny mounds stretching into the distance, each representing a childhood cut short. Infants were buried in simple cloth wrappings. Older children rested in rough wooden boxes assembled hastily by neighbors or charity workers. A few graves had small carvings, a lamb, a cross, a short phrase, but most remained bare, their stories lost the moment the earth closed over them. Funerals for poor children were brief. Families could not afford long ceremonies or elaborate mourning customs. Sometimes only one or two people attended, carrying the small body wrapped in a blanket. Some parents arrived holding another child's hand, unable to leave their remaining children alone. Others did not attend at all, because work could not be missed. Employers rarely granted time for grief. Survival demanded constant labor even on the day a child was buried. For the children left behind, these cemeteries became quiet places. They understood far too well. Some had siblings resting there. Others had friends whose laughter lingered only in memory. They walked past the iron gates, knowing that childhood for many ended before it had truly begun. The sight of those small graves served as a persistent reminder of how fragile their own lives were. These burial grounds also revealed a deeper truth about Victorian society. Progress and prosperity flourished alongside neglect. While newspapers celebrated industrial success and the expansion of cities, graveyards filled with children told another story, one of sacrifice, inequality, and the brutal cost of survival for the poor. Yet these cemeteries rarely appeared in public conversation. People preferred not to acknowledge them, as though silence could erase the reality buried beneath the soil. And still, life went on. Streets bustled with noise. Factories roared. Markets opened each morning. The chatter of daily business drowned out the memory of the children, whose lives had ended quietly without recognition. Only their families carried the weight of their absence, returning home to beds that suddenly felt too large, or chores that no longer needed the hands of the child who once performed them. In these neighborhoods, grief became woven into the fabric of everyday existence. Parents learned to harden themselves against despair, not because they did not love their children, but because sorrow clung to them constantly. Hope flickered in small gestures in a shared meal, a warm glance, a rare moment of laughter, but it dimmed each time another child fell ill or disappeared into a workplace where danger waited. Victorian childhood for the poor lived under the constant shadow of death. And in the cold, quiet rows of child cemeteries, the echoes of lost lives remained long after footsteps faded. Everything described here reveals how loss shaped childhood, long before children had time to live fully. What rises from these graves leads into the homes where young girls carried burdens they should never have known. Responsibilities forced upon them created wounds that lingered quietly beneath their daily struggles. For many Victorian girls born into poverty, childhood ended long before their bodies had time to grow. Their lives were shaped by vulnerability, from the moment they could walk exposed to men who saw them not as children, but as bodies to be used. In cramped tenements and overcrowded workhouses, girls lacked privacy protection and even the acknowledgement that they deserved safety. Their small voices carried no authority, and their protests dissolved into the noise of daily survival. The danger often came from within their own homes. Families shared one room, sometimes a single bed, and the thin walls did nothing to shield girls from the actions of drunk neighbors or violent lodgers. When men returned from factories late at night, exhausted and intoxicated, young girls became targets. They froze, swallowed fear, and prayed for daylight. Their mothers, equally powerless, often turned their faces away, numbed by the impossible choices poverty forced upon them. When pregnancy followed, the transformation was immediate and merciless. A child's body, unprepared for the weight and strain of carrying life, struggled under pressures it could not sustain. The swelling belly, the back pain, the dizziness, these were burdens even grown women feared, yet these girls endured them silently. Shame surrounded them, but the shame was never theirs to carry. Society punished them for circumstances, forced upon them, labeling them immoral, tainted, or ruined. No one questioned the men. Many of these girls were forced into roles far beyond their years. Instead of learning to read or playing in the alleys with other children, they became wet nurses or caretakers for infants belonging to wealthier families. Their own babies, weak from malnutrition, often died early, while they were required to nourish the child of a stranger. Their milk was considered more valuable than their grief. Others remained in workhouses, where they were given barely enough food to stay upright. Pregnancy was not seen as a reason to reduce labor. Girls scrubbed floors on their hands and knees, lifted heavy buckets of water, and completed laundry tasks that strained every muscle. Supervisors scolded them for moving slowly, unaware, or indifferent to the pain tightening their small frames. In the cold months, their breath shivered in the air as contractions threatened to begin too early. When the time came to give birth, the reality was brutal. Few had access to trained midwives. Most labored alone, or with minimal guidance from other poor women who had witnessed countless tragedies. Their young hips struggled to widen their bones, still soft and undeveloped. Hours of agony passed without relief. Some bled heavily, their bodies too fragile to withstand the intensity of childbirth. Others succumbed to infections in the days that followed, lying on straw mats that absorbed both sweat and blood. Their deaths were quiet, unnoticed by the world beyond their small circles. The girls who survived often faced another kind of suffering. Their bodies remained permanently changed, with pelvic damage, chronic pain, or weakness from hemorrhage. Their futures shrank. Employers avoided hiring them, fearing they would be unreliable or physically limited. Families judged them harshly, whispering about dishonor. Some were cast out entirely, forced into prostitution simply to survive. The cycle of exploitation tightened, drawing them deeper with each passing year. Emotionally, the toll was immeasurable. Girls who once played with scraps of cloth or sang to themselves during chores found their innocence replaced with heaviness. They carried memories of hands that hurt them, words that shamed them, and nights they wished they could forget. Holding their newborns, they oscillated between love and fear. They wondered whether their children would face the same fate, whether the streets and factories would claim them as brutally as they had claimed the mother. Even in moments of tenderness, there was a sense of fragility. a warm breath on their shoulder, a small hand curling around their finger, a heartbeat felt against their chest. These moments flickered like weak lanterns in a storm, overshadowed by the grim reality waiting outside the door. A newborn offered comfort but also responsibility far too heavy for someone not yet grown. The city around them continued its relentless pace. Carriages rattled over cobblestones. Factory whistles screamed. Chimneys spewed ash into skies dulled by smoke. Society marveled at progress, while girls who should have been in school or running across open fields endured adulthood forced upon them. They lived in the shadows of grand buildings and industrial triumphs, raising children while still children themselves. For Victorian girls trapped in these circumstances, survival meant adapting quickly. They learned to hold their crying infants with steady arms, even when their own hands trembled. They learned to hide pain behind stoic expressions. They learned to silence their fears and push forward one day at a time. Their resilience was quiet, unnoticed, and rarely praised. But it was real, carved into every breath they took and every step they managed afterward. Their stories were seldom recorded. Their names are rarely preserved. Yet the truth of their suffering lingered in the worn floorboards of workhouses, in narrow stairwells of cheap housing, and in the countless graves marked with nothing but soil. Victorian progress was built on the bodies of the young, and among them, these girls bore the deepest, most invisible wounds. Everything described here shows how girlhood disappeared long before these children had a chance to understand what innocence meant. What comes after this leads into the cruel labels society used to diminish the humanity of the poor. The stigma created for them carried deep consequences, shaping how they were treated in every corner of their lives. In the poorest corners of Victorian cities, children carried a label long before they carried a name. To the wealthy, they were not individuals with thoughts or dreams, but creatures shaped by dirt, disease, and desperation. The simple act of existing in a slum marked them as dangerous. People crossed the street to avoid them, tightened their grip on their belongings, and whispered that these children were born broken. A child could still be learning to speak, yet society had already decided what their life was worth. Public officials, clergy, and educated citizens often described poor children as breeding grounds of illness. Every cough was viewed as a threat, every torn sleeve a sign of moral decay. It did not matter whether the child had any choice in where they lived or how they survived. Their bodies were treated like carriers of contamination. The stares they received were not curious or compassionate. They were fearful, disdainful, and cold. On the streets, this perception shaped every interaction. Shopkeepers refused to let them near their doors, even if the children merely wanted to look inside. Policemen assumed guilt before innocence, gripping batons at the sight of a group of boys playing in the alley. A girl walking alone was automatically judged as trouble. Their presence was treated as an intrusion, their footsteps as noise that should not exist in respectable spaces. Inside institutions, the treatment was even harsher. Workhouses and orphanages functioned on the belief that poor children were inherently flawed, needing strict discipline to prevent them from becoming criminals. Food was rationed not only for the economy, but also as a form of punishment. Speaking during meals resulted in beatings. Asking questions was discouraged. Showing discomfort was labelled as disobedience. They learned to keep their heads down, their voices soft, and their emotions buried. Legally, their status offered almost no protection. Victorian law recognized the rights of children only when their parents were wealthy enough to matter. A child from a privileged family could expect defense representation and social outrage if harmed. A poor child, on the other hand, could disappear without leaving a mark on any document. Courts rarely prosecuted crimes against them. Judges claimed the poor lived in circumstances where misfortune is expected, as though hardship erased their humanity. Even charitable organizations meant to help often reinforced these ideas. Donations were tied to moral expectations. A child had to appear grateful, obedient, and quiet to be considered deserving of aid. Those who looked rough or acted fearful were dismissed as hopeless cases. Their suffering was interpreted as character failure, not evidence of neglect or abuse. Adults judged them for displaying the very symptoms of poverty that adults themselves had created. Schools showed the same cruelty. Lessons for poor children were simplified under the belief that they lacked the capacity to learn. Teachers spoke to them with clipped tones, as if volume could force understanding into minds they saw as inferior. Mistakes were punished physically. Curiosity was seen as insolence. Even the architecture of classrooms reflected hierarchy. cramped desks, broken windows, and freezing floors for the poor, while wealthier districts had buildings warmed by coal-filled stoves. The emotional impact of being treated as lesser beings carved deep wounds. Children learned early that people avoided holding their hands, recoiled from their touch, or flinched at their smell. They felt shame not for something they did, but for something they were told they were. Some tried to scrub themselves clean with cold water from a public pump, hoping it would make others look at them differently. Others stopped trying altogether, convinced cleanliness or effort could not change how the world saw them. On street corners, adults talked about them as though they were invisible. They spoke of the filthy children, the wild ones, the ones who should be controlled. Those words floated through the air and settled into the minds of the children who heard them. In time, some began to believe these judgments. A boy who was called a thief often enough might decide he had no choice but to steal. A girl labeled impure learned not to expect kindness. When epidemics struck, accusations came quickly. Newspapers blamed poor children for spreading disease across the city, claiming their presence endangered respectable families. Sanitization efforts focused on removing them from sight rather than improving their conditions. Workhouses became overcrowded prisons, meant to contain the problem, not solve it. The city took comfort in distancing itself from the children it had abandoned. Despite this, the children found small moments of resilience. They whispered jokes to one another in dark hallways, shared scraps of food without needing to ask, and offered silent companionship on freezing nights. They created their own fragile sense of belonging because the world outside offered none. These bonds were often the only thing that reminded them they were human, but reality remained unforgiving. Every day reinforced the message that they were lesser, less important, less worthy, and less protected. Society built walls around them, not to keep them safe, but to keep them out. These walls were made of laws, prejudice, and fear thick enough to shape their futures before they could shape them themselves. And through it all, the children continued breathing in a world that rarely noticed. Everything described here reveals how these children were treated as burdens long before they could defend themselves. What rises from this cold judgment leads straight into the world where confinement replaced care. Hidden places awaited them, ruled by hands that punished far more often than they protected. Children who slipped through the cracks of Victorian society were often gathered up with a speed that felt almost mechanical. No one asked how they ended up on the streets, or why they had taken a stale crust of bread from a stall already overflowing with food. Being poor was enough to make them suspicious. Being homeless made them guilty. And so many children found themselves pushed toward the gates of the so-called reform schools, institutions that claimed to correct bad behavior, but instead operated like quiet prisons, hidden behind the facade of moral improvement. These places accepted any child deemed troublesome. A boy who slept in a horse stable to escape the cold could be labeled a vagrant. A girl found begging in front of a bakery because she had not eaten for 2 days could be taken as a public nuisance. The law favored order over mercy, and order was easiest to enforce on those who could not defend themselves. Once a child was taken away, the process moved swiftly. Paperwork was thin, explanations were minimal, and most families, if there were families, received no notice at all. Some children disappeared from the streets without anyone remembering their names. Inside the reform schools, the promises of education and discipline quickly dissolved into a harsher reality. Days began before sunrise with shouting that echoed through long corridors. Children were lined up in rows, their clothes torn, their faces tired from nights spent on thin mattresses stuffed with old straw. They were not asked about their pasts. The assumption was always the same: they were broken, and the school would fix them whether they wished it or not. Work replaced learning. The youngest tied bundles of rope or sorted coal until their fingers blistered. Older children carried heavy sacks across the yard, or scrubbed stone floors until their knees ached. Food was a thin porridge that never filled their stomachs. The bowls were handed out with the same indifference as the orders barked at them each morning. Many children were already underfed when they arrived. The diet inside the schools only made their bodies weaker. Discipline came in many forms, none of them gentle. Beatings were delivered with canes or leather straps, sometimes without a reason being offered. Standing in a cold hallway for hours was considered a mild punishment. More severe cases involved isolation in a dark room that smelled of damp walls and old fears. The idea was to crush disobedience before it could take shape, but what it truly crushed was the sense that kindness could exist anywhere in their world. Some children tried to run. The gates were high, the fences sharp, and the guards quick to notice movement, yet desperation drove them again and again toward escape. Those who were caught returned with bruises and swollen faces. Others were never seen again, not because they escaped successfully, but because no one cared enough to record what happened next. The silence around these disappearances became an ordinary part of the institution's rhythm. Many of the children had no families searching for them. Their parents had died or abandoned them, or simply lacked the means to intervene. Poverty diluted love into helplessness. Even when a relative managed to reach the school, they were often turned away with claims that the child needed correction or that release would only encourage further misbehavior. The voice of the institution carried more weight than the voice of any poor parent. Despite the harshness, children still found small ways to survive emotionally. They whispered stories at night when the supervisors were out of earshot. They shared scraps of bread or saved a portion of their thin supper for a weaker child. Some formed fragile friendships that lasted only until one of them was transferred to another building or taken away for punishment. These moments did not soften the cruelty of the place, but they revealed that even in forced confinement, children clung to the instinct to comfort one another. The most haunting aspect of these reform schools was how normal they appeared to outsiders. Visitors saw neat rows of beds, disciplined lines of children, and tidy ledgers filled with official signatures. What they did not see were the trembling hands during morning roll call, the quiet sobbing at night, or the bruises hidden beneath thin sleeves. Respectability covered everything, and society preferred the illusion. Reform schools were presented as solutions to urban disorder, not as places where childhood itself was quietly dismantled. When children finally left those who survived long enough to be released, they carried with them scars shaped by fear rather than guidance. Many re-entered the world with no skills except obedience, and no expectations except hardship. Some drifted back to the streets, where they had been taken months or years before. Others vanished into the workforce, while still underdeveloped, their bodies pushed into adult labor long before they were ready. The reform schools claimed to prepare them for life, but in reality, they prepared them only for struggle. Everything described here exposes how reform schools turned survival into punishment for children who had committed no real wrongdoing. What unfolds from this cruelty leads toward the machinery that treats young lives as tools for economic gain. A deeper form of exploitation waited ahead, built carefully on the belief that a child's value existed only in what could be taken from them. Children in Victorian cities often learned early that their worth was measured not by who they were, but by what they could produce. The moment a child could lift a small tool, tie a knot, or carry a bucket, adults around them saw potential not for growth but for labor. Factories, workshops, and mines did not look at children as individuals with futures. They saw them as inexpensive, obedient, and replaceable. Childhood in this system was not a stage of life, but an interruption of productivity. Many children never experienced it at all. They were treated as extensions of the machines they worked beside, pieces of living equipment that needed no apology once worn out. Employment agents traveled through poor districts, offering promises that sounded like opportunity. In reality, these promises were traps. A job in a textile mill meant long hours inhaling fibers that settled deep in young lungs. Work in a match factory meant exposure to chemicals that ate away at teeth and jawbones. A position in a pottery workshop meant shaping clay coated with lead dust, a substance that slowly weakened the nervous system. The dangers were obvious to anyone who looked closely, yet no one in power chose to look. Children were cheap, and cheapness allowed the system to flow without interruption. Parents often had no choice. A mother working 12-hour shifts at a laundry could not support several children alone. A father injured in a mine collapse might no longer be able to work at all. The smallest wage from a child, no matter how meager, could mean survival for the entire family. But poverty twisted that necessity into something darker. Employers took advantage of this desperation, hiring children at half or even a quarter of an adult's pay. Some were compensated not with wages, but with portions of food that barely sustained them. Their labor strengthened the economy, but their bodies grew weaker with each passing day. Factories liked children for reasons beyond low wages. Their small hands could reach between moving gears. Their narrow shoulders fit into tunnels adults could not enter. This physical suitability, however, placed them directly in harm's way. Accidents were common. A misplaced step near a spinning frame could sever fingers. A stumble in a coal cart tunnel could end in collapse. Supervisors rarely paused production for injuries. A worker who could not keep pace was simply replaced, and children being plentiful were the easiest to replace of all. Punishments ensured compliance. Children who slowed down or complained were struck with sticks, leather straps, or metal tools. Some were locked in small rooms with no light until they agreed to work faster. Others were denied food, a tactic that left them trembling with hunger, while still expected to meet their quotas. These consequences were never recorded in ledgers. The official documents spoke of efficiency, responsibility, and progress, but said nothing of bruised ribs or broken spirits. What is most unsettling is how normalized this cruelty became. Political leaders praised industrial growth, ignoring the tiny hands that turned the wheels behind it. Business owners spoke proudly of innovation, though much of that innovation rested on child labor that cost almost nothing. Newspapers published stories about national prosperity, rarely mentioning that prosperity was built on the bodies of the poor. The public accepted this imbalance because it was familiar, because it had always been this way, or because they believed poverty was the fault of the poor themselves. Even institutions meant to provide protection contributed to exploitation. Parish officials placed orphaned children in workhouses under contracts that resembled ownership more than employment. Charitable groups arranged apprenticeships that offered little training, but plenty of repetitive labor. Some courts sentenced children to industrial service for minor offenses, transforming punishment into profit for the very industries that needed more hands. The boundary between legal guardianship and economic extraction blurred until it nearly disappeared. Inside the workplaces, children formed small alliances to soften their circumstances. They warned each other when supervisors approached. They shared scraps of food hidden in pockets. They watched over younger children who could barely keep up with the pace. These small acts did not break the system, but they revealed something important. Even when treated as units of labor, children still carried a capacity for kindness that the world around them tried to extinguish. As the years passed, many of these children aged into adults without ever experiencing anything different. Their backs remained bent, their lungs damaged, their expectations narrowed. The system not only took their labor, it shaped their understanding of life itself. A person raised to believe they were replaceable often grew into an adult who believed nothing better could be expected. The consequences rippled across generations, reinforcing a cycle of poverty designed to sustain industry rather than human well-being. Reformers tried to intervene. They wrote reports, delivered speeches, and visited factories in attempts to raise awareness. But the wheels of progress moved slowly, and the voices of children, when they were heard at all, were easy to dismiss. Economic gain spoke louder than suffering. It took decades for laws to change, and even when they did, enforcement was inconsistent. The idea that a child's life had inherent value beyond labor challenged too many established beliefs. Society was willing to appear moral, but hesitant to surrender the benefits that came from ignorance. The most haunting truth is that these children were not hidden. They walked through the streets, marched into factories, and returned home covered in soot or dust. People saw them every day, yet their exploitation remained invisible because it was convenient to overlook. A society that prided itself on progress built that progress on a foundation of young shoulders, convincing itself that the sacrifice was necessary, natural, and even beneficial. Everything described here reveals how these children were pushed into lives designed around labor rather than growth. What emerges from this system leads toward institutions where confinement was disguised as guidance. A deeper cruelty waited within those walls, shaped by rules that punished survival itself. Charity in Victorian society often appeared gentle on the surface, wrapped in warm words about generosity and moral duty. Wealthy families spoke proudly of giving to the poor, and institutions displayed their missions as if compassion guided every decision. But for many children, charity was another doorway into exploitation. The signs outside these homes for care suggested safety, yet once a child stepped inside, the truth unfolded differently. What was presented as kindness frequently became a means of extracting labor from those who had no choice but to accept whatever help they were offered. When agents from charitable groups walked through slums, they carried themselves with the confidence of people who believed they were doing good. They selected children who looked hungry, sick, or abandoned, promising food, shelter, and education. Mothers who could not feed their children felt pressured to agree. Some were told it was temporary. Others were assured their children would gain skills that would secure better futures. But good intentions, when mixed with power, often twisted into something else entirely. Once the children were taken, the families had almost no way to reclaim them, and the institutions faced little accountability for what happened behind their doors. Inside the charity houses, the reality was stark. Children were assigned chores from morning until evening. The smallest scrubbed floors with hands already raw from cold water. Others washed linens, carried coal, or stitched garments until their fingers cramped. Boys chopped wood or hauled buckets up narrow stairs. Girls worked in laundry rooms where steam burned their faces and chemicals stung their eyes. These tasks were presented as training, but there was little variety and even less teaching. The children learned only how to repeat the same motions endlessly. Visitors who arrived from wealthy neighborhoods rarely saw this labor. Homes are prepared carefully for inspections. Beds were made, rooms tidied, and children instructed to sit straight, smile politely, and answer questions with rehearsed lines. The supervisors spoke eloquently about discipline and moral improvement. They pointed to ledgers filled with neat handwriting. They described the children as lost souls, now guided by order and purpose. Wealthy donors left feeling comforted, confident that their charity money supported something noble. The children waited until the doors closed before returning to their work. Some institutions used the children to collect more donations. They dressed them in worn but presentable clothes and paraded them before churches or crowded streets. The sight of thin faces and small bodies evoked sympathy, and coins fell generously into baskets. Yet the children rarely saw the benefits of this sympathy. The funds circulated among administrators, building upkeep and public displays, meant to strengthen the institution's reputation. The children remained hungry, cold, and overworked, standing at the center of charitable stories while receiving almost nothing from them. Photographs became another tool. Families with social influence visited the homes to take portraits, holding the children, their gloved hands resting gently on small shoulders. These images served as symbols of benevolence, proudly displayed in parlors. Once the photographs were taken, the wealthy guests departed, returning to lives untouched by the hardship they had briefly posed beside. The children remained where they had always been, overlooked, except when convenient. Education, though promised, was minimal. Only a few hours each week were dedicated to reading or simple arithmetic. The rest of the time was spent working, often producing goods that the institutions sold for profit. Some children made soap, others sewed clothing for factories. Their labor-filled shelves and lined pockets were presented publicly as part of their moral improvement. In private, it was simply unpaid work extracted from those who had no power to refuse. Punishments were common. Children who spoke out of turn or slowed their pace were disciplined swiftly. They might be locked in cold storage rooms or forced to stand still for hours. Staff members justified such actions as necessary to build character, but a character built on fear reshaped a child's understanding of kindness into something sharp and unpredictable. Many grew to distrust anyone who spoke softly, because softness often preceded exploitation. Despite these harsh conditions, children found ways to care for one another. Older girls taught younger ones how to complete tasks more efficiently, saving them from punishment. Boys shared scraps of bread, tucked secretly into pockets. At night, when supervisors finally left the room, they whispered stories of the lives they once had, grounding themselves in memories to avoid feeling erased. These fragile connections were the only form of comfort in a place that offered little else. What made this duality so haunting was how seamlessly it blended into Victorian society. Newspapers praised charities for their noble efforts. Church leaders spoke about the duty to rescue children from vice. The public admired these homes as signs of progress and moral order. Few asked how deeply the system depended on the labor of the very children it claimed to protect. Even fewer questioned whether a charity that required suffering was a charity at all. When children eventually left these institutions, if they were allowed to leave, they carried scars that shaped their futures. Many entered the workforce unprepared for anything but obedience. Some became domestic servants, others factory workers, continuing the cycle of exploitation that charity had introduced them to. Their bodies bore marks of long hours and harsh discipline. Their minds carried the weight of promises that never came true. Everything described here shows how charity shifted from protection to exploitation with unsettling ease. What rises from these contradictions leads toward a form of labor that traveled far from home. Some children would be sent across the world, taken from their streets, only to work on distant soil. Children who vanished from the streets of Victorian cities did not always disappear into nearby institutions. Some were taken much farther, far beyond the alleys where they had been born, beyond the factories that once consumed their days, beyond even the reach of any family who might have searched for them. Ships leaving crowded ports carried goods for the empire, but they also carried children. Many of these young passengers had no understanding of where they were going or why. They boarded not with luggage, but with fear and with the unspoken knowledge that no one had asked whether they wished to leave. Recruiters moved quietly through poor districts, offering promises that sounded like opportunity. They spoke of work, food, and warm climates. They told parents, those few who remained with their children, that life overseas meant better chances than the harsh conditions of the cities. But most of the children taken did not even hear these promises. They were swept up from workhouses, grabbed from streets, or transferred out of reform schools under administrative decisions that no one questioned. Paperwork was thin or non-existent, allowing the movement of children to remain untraceable. Once they stepped onto the ships, their identities dissolved into the machinery of empire. The voyages were long and harsh. Children were crowded into lower decks with poor ventilation and little space to move. Seasickness overwhelmed many of them, but illness brought no special care. Food was simple and scarce. Fresh water was rationed. Nights were cold, and the sound of the hull creaking beneath waves was a constant reminder of how far they were drifting from anything familiar. Some children tried to memorize the faces of others around them, hoping to form connections strong enough to endure the journey. But the constant shuffling of bodies and the faint smell of sickness blurred these attempts at comfort. On arrival in colonies such as India or Australia, the reality became clear: this was not an opportunity. This was labor, disguised as relocation. Children were handed over to plantation owners, mining camps, or isolated settlements, where work demanded more strength than most adults could muster. The youngest were assigned to carry tools, sort materials, or clean living quarters for overseers. Older ones cut sugarcane, tended livestock, or dug through rocky ground in search of minerals. The climate was harsh, hotter than anything they had known, and their bodies struggled to adjust. The absence of documentation meant these children existed without legal recognition. Without identification, they could not complain, file grievances, or request return passage. Many did not even know the names of the towns or regions they had been sent to. They were simply expected to work until their usefulness faded. Supervision was strict discipline, harsh, and escape nearly impossible. The colonies stretched vast and wild, and even if a child fled, there was nowhere safe to run. Some of the children fell ill shortly after arriving. Tropical diseases struck quickly, and the lack of proper rest made recovery difficult. A child weakened by fever might be left alone in a shed or makeshift shelter, with little more than water and the faint hope of improving. If they did not, they were buried in unmarked ground, their names never recorded. To the overseers, they were replaceable. To the empire, they were invisible. Others simply disappeared without explanation. A child sent into a dense forest to gather firewood might never return. One assigned to carry supplies along steep paths might slip or be swept away by sudden rain. Rumors circulated quietly among the workers. Stories of children taken by wild animals, lost in storms, or punished so severely that they no longer reappeared. These stories were shared in whispers, not because they were unbelievable, but because they were common enough to sound ordinary. Communication with home was nearly impossible. Even children who remembered their original addresses had no way to send letters. Overseers did not provide materials, and workhouses in Britain rarely tracked their exported children. Parents who attempted to inquire were told only that their children had been moved for training or better prospects. Some families spent years believing their children were still somewhere within the city, never imagining they were thousands of miles away, in a land they could not pronounce. The psychological toll was immense. Children grew up knowing they had been transported not because of their potential, but because of their expendability. They worked among adults who viewed them as tools. Friendships formed quickly out of necessity, but were often broken by reassignment, illness, or death. Identity itself became fragile, replaced by whatever name or number overseers chose to use. Some children forgot their hometowns. Others forgot their birthdays. A few forgot the sound of their own languages. Yet within these harsh environments, traces of resilience remained. Children shared water during the hottest days. They whispered songs from home when the overseers were out of earshot. They carved small marks into trees or stones, hoping someone would someday read them and understand that they had once existed beyond this place. These gestures were small, but they carried meaning, the quiet insistence that even in forced labor, even stripped of rights and visibility, they remained human. The empire justified these practices as beneficial, claiming that children were given structure and purpose. Reports sent back to Britain painted idyllic images: children learning trades, living in healthy climates, growing into productive adults. The truth stayed hidden in distant fields and mines, where no inspectors bothered to travel. A system that stretched across continents, relied on silence, distance, and the belief that the poor could be moved like cargo without consequence. Everything described here exposes how distance became a tool to erase the suffering of children taken from their own streets. What unfolds from this removal leads toward voices that refuse to stay quiet even when surrounded by fear. Punishment for speaking out grew sharper, creating stories that haunted those who survived to remember them. Voices that dared to challenge the rules inside Victorian institutions rarely lasted long. Any sign of resistance, whether a whispered complaint, a frightened question, or a refusal born from exhaustion, was treated not as a cry for help, but as an offense. Supervisors believed order depended on silence, and silence depended on punishment. So the smallest spark of defiance, even from a starving or terrified child, led to consequences designed to extinguish that spark as quickly as possible. Those who protested faced punishments meant to humiliate and isolate. Some had their mouths bound tightly with cloth, the rough fabric pressing against their skin until speaking became painful. Others were dragged into narrow isolation rooms, where darkness erased any sense of time. These rooms, cold and airless, carried the stale smell of fear left behind by those who had been locked inside before. For many children, the worst part was not the isolation itself, but the knowledge that no one would come until the supervisors decided they had learned their lesson. Public discipline was another tool used to enforce submission. Supervisors gathered the entire group and forced the accused child to stand at the center. A mistake as small as slowing down during work or crying from exhaustion became an excuse for harsh punishment. Kneeling on sharp stones, being struck repeatedly, or wearing painted signs describing their supposed misconduct, all were considered appropriate corrections. The humiliation cut deeper than the blows. Children who had once been lively or outspoken learned to lower their gazes, silence their thoughts, and shrink themselves to avoid attention. Attempts at quiet resistance continued despite the risks. Small acts of courage, warning a friend of an approaching supervisor, slipping a crust of bread into another's pocket, or holding someone's hand in the dark, allowed them to cling to pieces of humanity that the institution tried to erase. But supervisors watched for these small rebellions. Any hint of solidarity provoked new punishments, as though kindness itself posed a threat to the institution's authority. For some, the pressure became unbearable. Stories circulated of those who could no longer endure the endless cycle of work, punishment, and silence. A few took drastic steps to escape their torment, choosing death over another day under the institution's control. Their names were rarely recorded. Their deaths were attributed to illness or accident. A child who broke under force was never seen as a victim, only as a confirmation that discipline had been necessary. Labels made the cruelty easier to justify. Words like wicked, devil-born, or incorrigible were used freely, transforming frightened children into imagined threats. Once burdened with such a label, everything they did was interpreted as rebellion. A flinch became defiance. A tear became manipulation. A moment of hesitation became evidence that more punishment was needed. In this system, children were not allowed to feel pain. They were only allowed to obey. Some of these so-called rebels had simply been spirited or curious before entering the institution. In wealthier households, the same traits would have been praised as intelligence or strength, but poverty changed the meaning of everything. A poor child with confidence was a problem. A poor child with independence was a danger. Institutions sought not to nurture but to break, reshaping individuality into submission. Even so, traces of resilience survived. Some children refused to cry during punishment. Others stared defiantly at their supervisors even when trembling. And in rare, quiet moments, they shared stories of who they once were, reminding each other that identity existed beyond the walls that confined them. These fragile acts were not enough to overturn the system, but they were enough to keep a small part of themselves alive. The damage inflicted stretched far beyond childhood. Those who survived and eventually left carried unseen wounds into adulthood. Many struggled to speak up for themselves, conditioned to believe their voices held no value. Others lived with fear triggered by authority figures, dark rooms, or sudden loud sounds. The world outside offered more freedom, but the past remained etched into their thoughts, shaping every attempt to build a life that felt safe. Institutions did not concern themselves with these consequences. Administrators focused on maintaining order and presenting an image of discipline to outsiders. Reports highlighted improvement, moral correction, and structure. Inspectors rarely spoke directly to the children, relying instead on the words of supervisors who had every reason to conceal the truth. And society, eager to believe in its own sense of progress, accepted these polished versions without questioning what lay beneath them. The reality was that rebellion among these children was never wickedness. It was often fear, hunger, or the instinctive desire to protect one's dignity. But in a world that valued obedience over understanding, those basic instincts were treated as crimes. The children learned to survive by remaining quiet. Yet silence did not mean they accepted their fate. It only meant they had learned the cost of speaking. Everything described here shows how defiance was twisted into guilt, turning young voices into targets of punishment rather than cries for help. What emerges from this reality leads toward an ending shaped by grief, reflection, and the weight of everything these children endured. A closing reckoning waits built from truths that society once chose not to see. To look closely at the Victorian age is to witness a world that often celebrated progress while quietly hiding the cost paid by its youngest. Streets bustled with new inventions, chimneys released steady columns of smoke into the sky, and newspapers praised the energy of a nation reaching toward industrial greatness. Yet woven into that energy was a silence, steady, uncomfortable, and persistent. It was the silence of children whose lives were shaped not by possibility, but by duty, hardship, and exhaustion. Their presence supported the era, but their suffering was rarely acknowledged, as though history itself had learned to look away. The accomplishments of that time were undeniable. Railways expanded across the country, connecting distant towns with speed never seen before. Factories multiplied, filling cities with noise and labor. New wealth flooded into the hands of those who managed industries and invested in steam, steel, and coal. But none of these achievements appeared without the labor of thousands of children. Their small bodies entered spaces too narrow for adults, their hands performed tasks requiring precision, and their wages, small or non-existent, kept production costs low. They were part of the machinery functioning quietly and without recognition. Public pride grew as the empire expanded its influence across continents. Wealthy families displayed imported goods in their homes, such as sugar-fine fabrics and polished silver. Few paused to imagine the children who handled those materials in the early stages of production. A polished table, a warm fire, or a pristine garment often carried the hidden weight of a child's exhaustion. Each object represented a chain of labor that reached back to a factory floor or a crowded workshop where children stood for hours without rest. Victorian ideals praised discipline and moral character, yet those ideals were applied unevenly. Children of wealthy families were encouraged to learn music, read widely, and cultivate polite manners. Children of the poor were expected to work. Their days began early and ended late. Their education, if it existed at all, was minimal. Their playtime was non-existent. They lived in crowded streets where illness spread quickly, and they slept in rooms where cold air seeped through thin walls. The gap between the protected and the unprotected widened with every passing year. Many children never knew a life without fear. The constant threat of hunger shaped their behavior. The possibility of punishment shaped their posture. Institutions that claimed to offer guidance often imposed strict routines with little compassion. Workhouses demanded obedience. Factories demanded speed. Reform schools demanded control. In each place, children learned that survival depended on staying quiet and keeping pace. Individual needs were dismissed as inconveniences. Their voices held no weight in systems built to overlook them. Adults who benefited from the era's progress rarely acknowledged the shadow behind their success. Political leaders spoke about prosperity, moral guardians lectured about responsibility, and industrialists praised technological advancement. But the words child labor seldom reached public debate. When reports did mention young workers, the tone was often dismissive, implying that work built character or that poor families had no other choice. The suffering of children became a background detail, visible but unaddressed, known but unexplored. Children absorbed these attitudes without fully understanding them. Many internalized the belief that their only purpose was to serve. Some grew into adults unable to imagine a future beyond labor. Others carried deep emotional wounds that shaped their relationships, their self-worth, and their sense of safety. The consequences stretched far past childhood, touching every part of life that followed. And because these consequences were quiet, society continued, without stopping to notice. Behind the elegant dresses, ornate gatherings, and polished celebrations of Victorian society lay countless stories left untold. A child who fell from exhaustion in a textile mill, a boy who inhaled coal dust until his lungs weakened, a girl who lost her childhood to domestic servitude, a child was transported across the ocean to work on foreign land. These stories belong to real lives, lives that were shortened, reshaped, or silenced entirely. Their absence from public memory was not accidental. People found it easier to celebrate progress than to confront suffering, and so entire histories were written without acknowledging those who endured the most. Museums displayed inventions, books praised innovators, statues honored leaders. But the children who powered the factories, cleaned the chimneys, carried the loads, and filled the workshops were left in the margins, remembered only when someone looked for them intentionally. Change arrived slowly. Laws were introduced, wages adjusted, and working hours shortened. Schools became more accessible. Inspections grew stricter. Gradual improvements lifted some of the burdens that had once been considered normal. But these reforms came late for many who had already lived their childhoods in conditions that harmed their bodies and limited their futures. No policy could give back the years they had lost or erase the hardships they had endured. Even with reform, the legacy of the Victorian era remains complex. Its inventions shaped the modern world, yet its treatment of children stands as a reminder of how progress can grow unevenly, lifting some lives while leaving others behind. To understand the era honestly is to recognize both its accomplishments and its failures. The suffering of its children is not an unfortunate footnote. It is part of the structure that supported the era's achievements. The memory of those children deserves attention, not for sentiment, but for truth. Their work helped build cities, industries, and systems that still exist today. Their silence made room for the voices that celebrated progress. Their sacrifices shaped generations that followed. Forgetting them would mean accepting the same blindness that once allowed their suffering to continue unchecked. So as this story reaches its end, let the weight of their lives settle gently but firmly into awareness. Let the noise of factories fade. Let the images of crowded streets and dim workshops soften into stillness. The children of that time can no longer speak, but their experiences remain part of the world that grew beyond them. May the night carry these memories with quiet steadiness. May rest come easily after walking through these histories. The past is heavy, but your thoughts can be light as you drift away from it. Good night.